Hey, good afternoon. I would like to call to order the meeting of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Revenue. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining. I will ask Mr. Reel to call the roll.
Senator Dennis.
Here.
Senator Tatro.
Here.
Assemblywoman Anderson.
Present.
Assemblywoman Considine.
Present.
Assemblyman Hafen. Assemblywoman Kasama. Assemblyman Yeager for Vice Chair Cohen.
Here.
And Chair Neal.
Here.
I'm sure you have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. I would like to start with opening remarks under agenda item number 2 with a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, the meeting material for today's meeting can be accessed on the committee's webpage located on the Nevada Legislature's website. Anyone who would like to receive electronic notification regarding the committee's agenda, minutes, and final report can do so by signing up on the legislative website. Any votes that are taken today will be done by a show of hands. There will be public comment period at the beginning and at the end of the meeting, and public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Public comment may be provided in 4 different ways, all of which are listed on the agenda. First, by calling the 669-900-6833 number, and then putting in the meeting ID of 834-4632-6420, and then pressing pound. You can also email at the revenue interim at lcb.state.nv.us. You can also mail your written comments to the Fiscal Analysis Division on 401 South Carson, or you can fax. If you still have one of those, we welcome that as well. So I would like to remind members of the committee, presenters, and other individuals in the Zoom meeting, the chat feature is only to be used for technical assistance with BPS. It is not to be used for any communication between members, presenters, or other individuals in the meeting, unless requesting technical assistance from BPS. If someone uses the chat feature during the meeting, the chair will ask the person to read into the record the information posted in the chat and remind everyone that the chat is a function to be used requested by technical assistance from BPS. Any links or information that a presenter would like shared during their presentation should be included in their slide deck, or other meeting materials provided to the committee must not be sent to the members through the chat feature. With that, we will move on to agenda item number 3, which is public comment. BPS.
Chair, the line is open and working. However, there are no callers at this time to provide public comment.
Okay. So we will go ahead and move to agenda item number 4, which is the approval of the minutes for January 26th meeting. I will ask for a motion to approve.
So moved.
So I have a first from Assemblywoman Anderson.
Second.
Is that Assemblywoman Considine?
Yes.
Okay. And so with the show of hands, all in favor to approve the minutes from January 26, 2022. Any opposed to the approval of the minutes? Okay, seeing none, the motion passes. So for this particular meeting today, we're going to move to agenda item number 5, but if you've looked at the entire agenda, the back part of the agenda is to go over missing items that we weren't able to complete in the prior meetings. And so I wanted to make sure I gave Fiscal Analysis a chance to present the data on liquor, And the other items, because they put in a lot of work on those slides and, we've been covering a lot of material. And so I wanted to give them a chance to cover all that information. So with that, we will start with our agenda item number 5, which is a presentation on the regulation and licensing by the Cannabis Compliance Board and the Cannabis Advisory Commission. Do we have our presenters ready?
Yes. Chair Neal, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Well, Chair Neal, Vice Chair Yeager, thank you very much for allowing us to be here today and present a little bit about the CCB. As the agenda item states, we'll talk a little bit about the structure and function of the CCB and the CAC, some statistics on the types and number of licenses. We'll talk about Assembly Bill 341, which authorizes consumption lounges, which includes the social equity applicant provisions. And then we'll talk, I believe at your request, about the delivery of cannabis products, so the mechanics of how delivery works. And then at that point, we can answer any questions. So I believe we have a PowerPoint. Tiana, if you want to pull it up. There we go. So I'll get started here. First slide is a timeline of Nevada's cannabis program. A lot of this you probably already know, so I'll breeze through this part. 2000, Nevadans voted to legalize medical use. In 2015, the first medical marijuana establishment opened. In 2016 was ballot question 2. This would legalize cannabis for recreational use, which passed. And so in 2017, recreational sales began in Nevada. The ballot question was entitled Regulate Cannabis Like Alcohol. So at the time, oversight was with the Department of Public and Behavioral Health under HHS. And so once recreational sales began, that oversight transitioned to the Department of Taxation, creating the Marijuana Enforcement Division within the Department of Taxation. From that point on, the industry grew at lightning speed, and it became quite apparent that the state would need a larger regulatory body or oversight body to oversee this industry. So in 2019, after a task force was created, AB 533 was signed, thus creating the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board. This board was to be modeled similar to that of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, both in its operation and structure, but also in the way that it regulated the cannabis industry. So a strict regulation, a greater emphasis on compliance, and a greater emphasis on suitability of the individuals that are in the industry. So in July of 2020 is when the Cannabis Compliance Board was fully authorized, and we began to take over all oversight responsibilities of the industry. So this is the mission statement. Not going to read it, but it draws inspiration from the Gaming Control Board's mission statement. Obviously, we detail the importance of strict regulation of all areas of the industry. That's also in the public policy of AB 533, which created the CCB. Some of the things that are different, obviously, is the focus on public health, which gaming doesn't necessarily have, just given the products and that we deal with here in the cannabis industry. And then, of course, holding our licensees and our staff and our agency to the highest ethical standards are something that's very important to us. The CCB board is made up of 5 members. They're all appointed by the governor. Currently, we are chaired by former Nevada Supreme Court Chief Justice Michael Douglas. Also on the board is Dennis Nylander. He is the longest-serving Nevada Gaming Control Board chair in history. We have Jerry Merritt. She's a longtime banking executive here in Las Vegas. Rihanna Durrett. She is the former executive director of the formerly known as the Dispensary Association. And Dr. Brian Young, a physician from the Reno area. Some of the board's duties and responsibilities. This is a part-time board. This board holds regular monthly public board meetings. We had our most recent meeting yesterday. At these meetings, the board reviews and approves all final licensures, transfers of interest, management service agreements. The board approves service of disciplinary actions, such as complaints. They act as the final arbiter of discipline. They approve any settlement agreements that come as a result of disciplinary action. The board also holds emergency board meetings from time to time to consider summary suspensions. I believe we've had one so far this year. We had a handful last year as well. In addition to the meetings, we host regular regulatory workshops. We held one yesterday after the board meeting on consumption lounge, which we can talk about a little bit later. And just so you're aware, in my role as the executive director, I oversee what will be 93 FTEs as part of the Cannabis Compliance Board staff, and that includes the daily operations and oversight of the industry, obviously alongside my tremendous chiefs here that are with me and on Zoom. So the Cannabis Advisory Commission is a body that was also created in AB 533 alongside the Cannabis Compliance Board. The Advisory Commission is a 12-member commission. It's chaired by myself in my capacity as executive director. The commission includes 8 representatives appointed by the governor with different expertise related to the industry. I would note that Vice Chair Yeager is also a member of the Advisory Commission. And in addition to the 8 representatives, it also includes the Nevada Attorney General, the Director of the Department of Public Safety, and the Executive Director of the Department of Taxation. Director Hughes, I believe, is also joining us today. Currently, and in my capacity as Executive Director and Chair of the Commission, I have the ability to appoint subcommittees when necessary. So far, I've created 4 subcommittees: Subcommittee on Public Health, Public Safety, one on Social Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and one on Market Stability. 3 of those, the first 3, have met over a dozen times between them, and the Subcommittee on Market Stability will begin likely meeting later this year when we start to discuss new licensing rounds. The Cannabis Advisory Commission was created to be somewhat similar to the Nevada Gaming Policy Committee, which, as I'm sure you know, meets at the direction of the governor when there is an issue within the gaming industry that should be studied and recommendations made. That's how this was designed, and we were able to put this commission in practice right away thanks to Assembly Bill 341, which authorized consumption lounges last year, which we'll also talk about in this presentation. Given the passage of that legislation, we had the Advisory Commission ready to meet following the legislative session. That is why I created those subcommittees to start discussing, researching, and analyzing issues around public health, safety, and social equity as they pertain to lounges. They made their recommendations towards the end of last year, and that is what staff and the board used in the development of the first draft of consumption lounge regulations that we are currently workshopping now. The Nevada Cannabis Compliance Regulations, the NCCR, this is our core set of regulations that guide Nevada's cannabis industry. There's 14 of them, soon to be 15, as consumption lounges is proposed to be the NCCR number 15. They were adopted at the board's inaugural meeting in July of 2020, and since they've been added to and amended as we've gone through the last year and a half plus. I would note that in the legislation that created the CCB, we are exempt from the Nevada Administrative Procedures Act. That is similar to how gaming is allowed to pass and promulgate regulations quickly. And I will tell you that it has been one of the biggest benefits. I'm very glad that that was included in there because of how quickly this industry moves. Our board has the ability to stay ahead of the changes by being able to pass regulations and promulgate regulations at a much quicker pace. The CCB is divided into, well, it has 4 divisions, divided into divisions, of course. Administration and licensing, inspection and audit, investigations, and enforcement. The Division of Administration and Licensing's role is to process and review license and renewal applications, and they also collect fees. They manage the Cannabis Agent Registration Card Program. That's over 16,000 active cannabis agent registration cards currently. And they also assist the Department of Taxation in collecting unpaid taxes from licensees. Something I think is important to note for this committee. When we came on board, we implemented a new process that for all license renewals, so when you renew your license annually, that you must be up to date on all of your outstanding taxes owed and any outstanding time and effort billings that have been issued throughout the year. And I would like to compliment Director Hughes. We have created quite a working relationship with the Department of Taxation to ensure we have that information on our licensees. That policy in itself has resulted in, I would say millions of taxes that have kind of been outstanding or overdue. It's amazing what the risk of losing your cannabis license would do to encourage you to pay that outstanding tax liability. So that's been a big success for us and in partnership with the Department of Taxation. Our Inspection and Audit Division, they perform audits and inspections of all cannabis facilities. Our inspections focus on health-related issues for the most part, and our audits look at the seed to sale tracking, which is the second bullet point here. Auditors also audit monthly and quarterly reports from licensees that they submit to the CCB and are required to submit. Our Investigations Division, this is probably the biggest departure from the last oversight body. Our Investigations Division, created to be similar to that of how Gaming's Investigations Division works. Our Chief of Investigations, who's here, actually came from Gaming. I borrowed him for a time, and then I convinced him to stay, and so we've really developed quite the Investigations Division here. They review and process all transfers of interest. So that is change of ownerships, sales of licenses, and any new owners that want to come in to the industry. They vet these licensees, any affiliated owners, officers, and board members. And this process includes a full suite of background checks, a financial analysis, and all of this is part of its suitability review. Something that wasn't included in the past and excluded now are actual in-person interviews, which are very important. So we sit down with these applicants and any known associates. This results in a 10 to 20 page report that goes in front of the board. And then these licensees or these applicants must come in front of the board and allow the board to ask them questions in a public meeting. And finally, our Enforcement Division, they evaluate all complaints made against a licensed facility, including incident reports. They also partner with our local and state law enforcement regarding criminal investigations and enforcement of the illicit market. Types of facilities that we regulate: cultivation facilities, where you grow the cannabis; production facilities, that's where items like edibles and vape pens and tinctures are produced; testing labs, all cannabis products before it's sold in the state of Nevada must be tested by an independent testing laboratory. These labs are licensed just like any other license in the cannabis industry. We also have distribution licenses. These licenses transfer product to the retail store. And then finally, we have retail dispensaries. These are the licensed operations that sell to the consumers. So I'll move on then to some statistics. We have over 761 total medical and recreational operational licenses statewide. I would like to point out, so if you're trying to get an idea of how many brick and mortar actual facilities we have, it's much easier to probably look at the left side or the left-hand column of licensed medical cannabis establishments. What we do here is we have a lot of, or for the most part, they're dually located or co-located. So that means you have a cultivation facility that has both a license to cultivate medical cannabis and a license to cultivate recreational cannabis. That doesn't mean two brick and mortar facilities. They're all housed in the same facility. So the left-hand column really provides an idea of how many actual facilities there are statewide. And thank you to Russell and his team. We provided a couple exhibits that they suggested would be helpful. You have a list of active licenses, and you have a list of active licenses by county, by type as well. Next, this is a slide also at the suggestion of Russell and his team. This describes some of the options for operations in the state of Nevada, two that we offer here in the state, and they're not offered in every other state. And that is the option to be both vertically integrated or standalone. And so a vertically integrated operation, which would be a licensee that owns both or all a cultivation, a production, a distribution, and a dispensary. So they own a license type from the top to bottom of the chain. Then we have standalone operations as well. That means you can own just a cultivation facility, you can own just a cultivation and production facility, or you can own just a dispensary. Now, nothing prevents a vertically integrated operation from buying product from somebody else and bringing it into their facility. In their dispensaries, they can sell other product as well. Being vertically integrated, however, just allows you to have total control of all of your inventory from growing it and into selling it. And with these different operational models, standalone businesses can buy other cannabis licensees, so you can be a standalone and you can become vertically integrated. And on the flip side, you can be vertically integrated and sell off one of your licenses. I don't want to make it sound like that is easy. It is a very small market out there for new licenses and new facilities. It's very expensive, and also these licenses are tied to the jurisdiction that they originally opened in. And so if you wanted to have yours co-located or be at the same spot, that would also provide some more difficulties in trying to become vertically integrated if you weren't. All product, no matter what the operation is, has to go into an independent testing lab, as I mentioned. I would also like to note that you cannot have shared ownership. So you cannot own a cultivation, production, distribution, or dispensary and also own any part of an independent testing lab. It's important that we keep those labs impartial to the other licensees. So that's the end of the structure and then the statistics. Chair, do you want me to just keep kind of powering through until the end, or would you like me to stop before I get into Assembly Bill 341?
No, I want you to keep going. Keep going.
Okay, great. So I'll move on to Assembly Bill 341, sponsored by Vice Chair Yeager as well. This bill passed last session, and this authorized the CCB to begin to license and regulate cannabis consumption lounges. Just some broad strokes of the bill. Initially, retail dispensaries may apply for and open one retail lounge per licensee. When we started this process, we asked for letters of intent from current retail stores asking if they would be interested or if they plan on opening a retail attached consumption lounge. We received over 45 letters of intent. So we anticipate a strong desire and interest for most of our dispensaries who can to open up a consumption lounge. There will also be 20 independent lounges, so they'll be independent of a retail store, which will be allowed to open at the beginning, so in the initial licensing round. And 10 of those 20 independent lounges will be designated for social equity applicants, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. I also thought it would be relevant for this committee to understand some of the fees initially to open or to apply, for a retail attached consumption lounge. There is a one-time non-refundable fee of $100,000 required to apply. If you are an independent lounge or you'd like to apply for an independent lounge, that will include a one-time non-refundable fee of $10,000 to apply for an independent lounge. I would note in the legislation, it allows for the CCB to reduce these fees, and we have proposed a reduction to these fees in our regulations for social equity applicants. A quick timeline on consumption lounges. So the bill was signed last June. And as I mentioned before, when I was talking about the advisory commission, we got started right away by calling the advisory commission to meet. I created those subcommittees so they could begin to study some of the issues around consumption lounges. They did that. They provided their recommendations towards the end of the year. I believe I mentioned that as well. And so mid-December was when the board held its first global workshop on the first draft of consumption lounge regulations, which includes both application and licensing regulations and the regulations around the operation of a consumption lounge. We had a great workshop in December. As you can imagine, a lot of public interest. So we had a lot of great feedback from members of the community, the public, local jurisdictions, and the industry. We took that feedback, released a second draft in, I believe, February, and that led us to yesterday's second workshop on consumption lounge regulations, also very well attended. I think the draft regulations are in a very good place. We may have one more workshop to make some final tweaks sharpen some of the edges, but I believe we are almost there on the operations and the licensing side of things. Once those regulations are done, they will then be put forth in front of the board at a board meeting for the board to vote to adopt those regulations. And once they sit for 15 days, then they will be officially regulations and we can get started, or registered regulations, and we can get started with the licensing process. Once that happens and applicants are licensed, they'll be able to open. Obviously, some facilities have been planning for this, so some are more ready to open than others, but I do feel like we will see some consumption lounges open before the end of the year, a lot of the other ones coming shortly thereafter throughout next year. So the social equity program, the bill, AB 341, this is the first time the social equity program was mentioned and listed. It's an exciting program, an exciting prospect for the CCB and I think for the state of Nevada. But the bill asks for the CCB to define what a social equity applicant would be before we issue this licensing round. One of the reasons I created the subcommittee on social equity, inclusion, and diversity was to study and make some recommendations on how we should define a social equity applicant. I would note, although she's not here on this committee, but Senator Dallas Harris is a member of that subcommittee as well, and I thank her for her work. Aisha Goins is the chair of that subcommittee. They had great meetings. They made great recommendations. And we were able to take those recommendations, do a little bit of deeper analysis and come up with what we proposed were the categories and the qualifications that one would need to become or be a social equity applicant. And I will tell you the spirit of those recommendations focused around crime rate and incarceration rate. It focused on socioeconomic disadvantage, and it focused on cannabis-related offenses. So those were kind of the qualifications you would need to meet to become or to qualify for a social equity license. The original recommendations used zip codes as the area, right, to determine if you would qualify for as a social equity applicant. In our analysis, we felt that we needed to drill down a little bit further. And so we went to census tracts from zip codes, which allowed us to get a little bit more specific in the areas that we feel were, and as the bill states, disproportionately affected by drug policy over the past couple decades. So again, 10 of the initial independent consumption lounge licenses will be designated for social equity applicants. Those applicants, either together or by themselves, must have and maintain 51% ownership of that license. You see the cannabis-related offense qualification, and then CCB may reduce the application fees. And, you know, from a staff perspective and from a board perspective, although we're developing this program for consumption lounges, it is certainly our intent to extend the social equity program to future licensing rounds for all licenses. So that concludes the consumption lounges. And then finally, Chair Neal, I believe you asked for some information on the delivery of cannabis products to consumers, a little bit about the mechanics. Recreational sales facilities are limited to 5 ounces of cannabis and cannabis products within a single trip. Now, we have an ounce purchase limit. So at best, when a delivery vehicle leaves a facility, they can make 5 trips. But they can make more if people don't order all the way up to an ounce before they have to return to the facility and secure more product. And medical sales facilities are limited to 10 ounces to deliver. The delivery driver must hold a cannabis agent registration card, and the vehicle must be inspected and approved by the CCP. Once an order is placed, the sales facility also confirms by phone or text that consumer is at least 21 years old. And when our delivery drivers go to deliver cannabis, they also scan, which is not listed here, they scan the ID at the point of passing that product over to the consumer and when they receive the cash and bring it back. Some statistics on the right here that I thought was interesting to note, and I've got some others that aren't listed here. So, delivery before the pandemic was certainly an offering, but it wasn't utilized very much. And you can see by the number of vehicle inspections in the year 2019, 113, also by the transaction data. We were averaging around 3,000 transactions a month by delivery before the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, you'll see in 2020, in that total year, we had over 941 vehicle inspections. So retail stores, the storefronts closed down during the pandemic, but cannabis facilities were able to still facilitate sales through delivery and then eventually curbside. We implemented a virtual vehicle inspection process during the pandemic to help get more delivery vehicles on the road. I think we did around 400 in the first weekend alone once the pandemic hit and the retail storefronts closed. And you'll see in 21, which I think is significant, is that number, 233 is over double than it was before. So obviously consumers are getting used to delivery. They're still utilizing delivery. I'll also say when we were averaging around 3,000 transactions a month in delivery, we are now averaging around 30,000 transactions a month through delivery. And so that's kind of our new middle ground here. And also important to note is drive-through and curbside pickup. Now, drive-through was always allowed, but only utilized, I think, by one facility before the pandemic up north. Now it's utilized much more often. Second is curbside pickup. This was not contemplated in the regulations. It was not utilized at all before the pandemic. So we put this structure and framework into place under the emergency rules, and it was very successful in allowing the industry to continue to make sales and keep their business going through the pandemic. So much so that the industry brought and we were in support of a bill that would put it into law, the allowance for curbside pickup. We have since put that in our regulations, and it continues to be utilized as a big model or a successful model currently. So not knowing exactly what taxation's presentation was going to look like, I'm not going to steal their thunder. So we're going to skip through these two, but it's taxable sales and then the excise tax collected. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to, go ahead.
Yeah, no, before you go there, I'm going to do the timeout and then we'll just talk about that presentation and then we'll get into the revenue collected. If that's okay. All right. So members, questions on the first part of this presentation? Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Neal, and thank you for the information. I actually have 3 questions. It's all from the slides. My slide numbers might be off though from what the presentation was about, but thank you. So much information coming at us. The first one has to do with actually the Cannabis Board itself, which on my packet it's slide 34, but I think that's because I get all the slides together. Is this a staggered appointment or will we have a brand new board every 6 years or every 4 years with the appointments?
So it is not staggered. Assembly Anderson, thank you for the questions. Tyler Klimas for the record. They are not staggered currently. So unless
we hired them staggered because
we hired them staggered. So and the reason I'm questioning that is because the bill allowed for 3 members to be appointed in a temporary status to get the board up and running. But I believe they were reappointed to a full 4-year term on July 1st. And so I'll confirm that with you. I'm sorry, I should know that, but I believe they're all on the July term. Let me confirm that with you, Assemblywoman. I'm sorry.
Quite all right. It's okay. I just think that's something for us to just be aware of because you don't want to have brand new individuals coming in, although you will have that background knowledge always. But to have the policymakers kind of make those decisions, I just think that's something to be aware of. The second question has to do with the when you're going through the investigations and audits and the questions, and I think it was slide 39 on mine. It has to do with the suitability review that kind of got my antenna up a little bit. Is the suitability review something that is defined in law, or something that is policy that is maybe brought forward to the to our legislative commission, or is it a suitability review question that is created by the cannabis board itself? So there's no elected official oversight of what exactly is suitability review.
Thank you again for the question, Tyler Clemens for the record. So I have here Chief Dave Staley, who is the Chief of Investigations. He comes from the Gaming Control Board, so he can talk a little bit briefly about what we look for and how we perform a suitability review.
So thank you, Assemblywoman Anderson. David Staley for the record, Chief of the Investigations Division for the CCB. The statutes provide a broad brush of multiple different things that our board should evaluate when they are determining whether or not an applicant qualifies or is suitable to receive the privileged licenses that they issue. The legislation also requires that the CCB regulate this industry more like the Gaming Control Board. So luckily we have the Nevada Gaming Control Board, which has been doing this for quite some time, and we're able to look at their processes to give us some example of the best way to accomplish that. So in meeting the requirements of the statute, we have come up with a process that mimics the Gaming Control Board, where we do background checks on all the individual applicants. We do a financial analysis of their income statements and balance sheets for the last 2 years. We look at their compliance with regulations for the Department of Taxation, for Nevada in general. We look at how they comply with the regulations of the individual local jurisdictions, city and county. And to get some idea of how we can expect them to operate here, we also reach out to other jurisdictions around the country to get a feel for how they operate in those jurisdictions, kind of giving us an example of their past history and what we can expect here. All that information is put together, as Director Klimas mentioned, into an investigative report. We do not recommend a conclusion. We provide the facts to the board members, and then based on their collective experience and the information included in the investigative report, they make a ruling to issue a license or not, depending on whether or not they believe that those applicants have met our standards to be suitable to receive that license.
Thank you. That was a huge clarification. Greatly appreciate it. And kudos on getting the millions of outstanding taxes paid. That was awesome. My last one has to do with the inspection of vehicles. I noticed on that last slide that we were going over that there's no expiration date for the vehicles themselves, but is there an expiration date for the drivers? Or are they, because again, looking at the slide you had at the bottom, that the vehicles, once they're inspected, they're good. They don't have to go through an inspection a second time. But there's nothing about the delivery driver agent registration. Is there a need to renew those or that sort of process? I realize this is maybe getting into the minutia a little bit. And so just a quick, yep, it's got to be renewed, or no, it doesn't.
Thank you for the question. So all agent registration cards must be renewed every 2 years and reapplied for every 2 years. And so that includes delivery drivers as well.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chair Neal, for allowing me so much time.
No, you're welcome. Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you, Chair Neal. Appreciate it. Director Klimas, just first want to say thank you to you and your team. I know this has been quite a process since July or June when this bill was first passed. So just want to recognize that this is not the easiest thing in the world to do, to get a new industry up and running. My question revolves around the existing dispensaries. And of course, in the bill, as you mentioned, they have the ability to open up a lounge, assuming they meet all the other requirements. And I think you indicated in your presentation that you received approximately 40 letters of intent. And so my question is, at a high level, can you give us a sense of like what percentage does that represent in terms of those operators who might be eligible to apply for one? Is it like half of them? Is it 75%? Just kind of trying to get a sense of, relatively speaking, what that interest level looks like with existing dispensaries.
Thank you, Vice Chair, for the question. Tyler Klimas, for the record. When we did an analysis, and obviously, a retail attached license, you can only have one per licensee, but a lot of that depends on the ownership structure. And so we won't know that ownership structure in many cases or how it compares until the applications come in. But long story short, we did an analysis that we thought maybe around 62 would be the number that would be allowed statewide. And so 45 tracked somewhat with that, because some people are going to choose potentially not to open up a consumption lounge. So if that gives you an idea or helps answer your question, we think around 60, and so 45 is pretty close to the saturation point.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Chair Neal.
Thank you for that. I believe Assemblyman Hafen.
Yes, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you for the presentation today. I'm looking forward to the second half with the taxes and everything else. I think you guys have done a great job collecting the back taxes. One of the questions that I've actually had some constituents asked was whether or not the board oversees labor laws like overtime.
Assemblyman, thank you for the question. Tyler Klimas, for the record. No, we don't oversee labor laws.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, any additional questions? Assemblywoman Anderson.
I think Assemblyman Hafen's question, though, does bring up a very good point. And under the suitability information, are labor laws under consideration as well, and an item that is investigated when somebody is applying?
Assemblywoman, thanks for the question. Tyler Klimas, for the record. I mean, if there is a history of violations of labor laws, any kind of lawsuits or litigation, then absolutely, that certainly relates to the suitability and moral standing of any kind of applicant. So yes, if that exists and that's out there, I believe the board would certainly want to know about it. And that's something that Chief Staley and his investigators would look into, interview about, and include as part of the report.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? So I had a question on the social equity licenses. So I was having a conversation with, and I may not state this correctly, but I was having a conversation about social equity, and someone had told me that I guess they had asked about set-asides, right? Trying to have particular set-asides within the social equity licenses, or what was established, I guess, in terms of diversity. And they were told that there couldn't be like a constructive set aside based on diversity. It needed to fit into criteria. And what they said to me, which kind of threw me off, was that there was a commerce clause issue. And I was just like, I don't understand. Like, are you talking about like dormant commerce clause? Where are we going with this? So I wanted to ask, if you're familiar with a conversation around set-asides within the social equity conversation, and what the response was related to it.
Chair Neal, thank you for the question. Tyler Klimas, for the record, and yes, and we have put in a number of hours into this analysis on this. And so, diversity, social equity, two separate things for purposes of consumption lounge, of licensing, and right, because social equity is about being disproportionately affected by drug policy, and then diversity is about getting new diverse applicants into the industry. And so just so you know, we agree, and where we started was trying to conceptualize some set-asides. So how could we set aside certain numbers? And this is separate and in part from the social equity. So if you were looking at the 10 independent lounges, how could we carve out or set aside maybe 20% of those, kind of like a construction contract, for minority-owned business or female-owned businesses? And that's where we started. And then became, then started the legal review, us talking to a lot of other states. Some other states have attempted that, and they continue to get overturned. They don't pass the scrutiny that's needed. And what we've come to the conclusion is, and Illinois similarly, is that we need to pursue a disparity study. Illinois just went out to an RFP for a statewide disparity study. We don't have one here, and it's. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but we do a demographic study. It's pretty clear what the makeup is of the industry, and that diversity, certainly needs to be worked on. But regardless, this disparity study is something that we're going to need to base that set aside on. And so that's where we ended. That's where we want to go. I know we're going to get there. We may need to make some tweaks next legislative session, but in the particular issue of set asides, we're just not able to get exactly there yet. But again, that is completely separate from social equity, which is protected. That program has been successful in other states, and I believe it'll be successful in this state as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was just super curious about that because I know that set asides are like 1986 language but there is, I distinctly remember there was case law, and I know I found it in 2013 that dealt with the dormant commerce clause where there was a business activity exception, like when a city or a political subdivision was acting as if they were a business. And that was it allowed this narrow pathway to deal with, racial groupings. It wasn't specifically set aside language. But the case, when I had looked at that case, it was like 100-year, it hadn't been overturned. And I did it in 2013 because it was like a weird rule that I found, and I used it for a redevelopment bill that I had in 2013 because I was trying to create, groupings or preferences within the redevelopment framework in 2013. And so when the person brought that up to me, I was just like, well, within the dormant commerce clause specifically, there's this really narrow ruling, but unless it's been recently overturned, it had been around for like a solid 50 years. So I wanted to ask that question, and once I find that case, maybe share it with you guys, because I think it is informative in how there is this nuanced piece around the dormant commerce clause around racial preferences. And, it's something that would be overlooked if you're not specifically looking for it. But I know I had hunted for it because I was looking for a pathway for my legislation. Anyway, so moving on. Senator Tatro.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple quick questions on the enforcement side and how that funding works, and if you have officers that are engaged in that, and then if you've had any issues of verification of age, and then the resale of it, say to minors, or and then lastly, if you've seen an increase or a decrease on the illegal market for the product. Sorry, that was kind of a lot.
No, that's right, Senator. Thank you for the questions, and Tyler Klimas for the record. And so we have 4 post-certified officers, which was new for oversight as well. And we got those as part of AB 533. We'll have 4 more beginning April 1st, and that was a result of the consumption lounge legislation. So we're definitely in a growth mode on enforcement. Obviously, we have 4 post-certified officers statewide, so our footprint is not as big as we would like it to be. We do try to expand that footprint with our relationships and our partnerships with local law enforcement. But on resale to minors, something that we are planning to implement both in partnership, and we are working with the Attorney General's office on some instances and on some programs currently. But what we would like to do is start to do regular minor compliance checks. It's something that we feel is very important, something that we don't necessarily have the resources to do yet, but we do feel that we're building in that direction. I think you also asked about the illicit market. Do I think it's growing? I will tell you, this, and we were at an illegal grow on Friday that Metro had served a warrant to a two-story house in the Southwest in Southern Nevada. It exists. I can't tell you if it's growing or not because the data on the illicit market doesn't exist. And it's something that we would love to pursue if it's even possible to get that kind of data. But there are illegal grows. Most of them are organized crime for nationals that are popping up across the valley where that product goes. It seems some goes to California, but then it comes back here. So, I'm not giving you an exact answer. It's a little bit of a roundabout, but it exists. I think it is somewhat robust. We're going to pursue a market study later this year just to get an idea of the health of our market before we issue licenses. And one thing I'm going to include in the requirements for that study is to see if we can get some better, more detailed, granular information on the illicit market. So how much is being consumed in the state? How much are we selling in the state? And hopefully by subtractions, we can get an idea of how big that illicit market is. But it exists and it's there.
Thank you. And have you found good cooperation with the partnerships of local law enforcement?
Senator, thank you. Tyler Climbs for the record. Yes. And that's across the state. Washoe, Clark, the rurals. It's been something that we focused on since day one, and it's paid dividends, I believe, on both sides.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh, Senator Dennis.
Thank you. I just want to follow up when you asked about the social equity program piece, just because I saw something on the news yesterday and I hadn't thought about it till I heard it. When it comes to, on that piece, I think it's page 45 where it talks about social equity. It says that they must have 51% ownership. My question about the ownership is, and what they reported was that ownership could be anybody, even non-Nevadans. And is that true? And if so, is that a legal issue, or is that just because it wasn't in the legislation to limit it to Nevada residents?
Senator, thanks for the question. Tyler Climbs for the record. And yes, that is after legal review, looking at other states, what has succeeded, what has not succeeded. That is the reason that we opened it up nationwide by census tracts.
So they could live in a census tract that's designated for social equity, but anywhere in the U.S. and apply for a license here. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Can you share the research like offline with me on the out-of-state language that you guys found? I'm just super curious about reading it.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We'd love to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, because P&I problems are always of interest to me. So on to revenue. Yay. So ready to start that part. Ready to go.
Well, thank you, Chair. And I hate to disappoint. It was only just two quick slides, but, so I will let start that conversation on taxable sales and excise tax, but you can see the numbers. But one thing that they don't have that I would like to highlight as part of this is just the other sources of revenue that the Cannabis Compliance Board uses or that we bring in as part of our operations. That's licensing and renewal fees, agent registration card fees, civil penalties, and time and effort billing. So those, along with wholesale tax revenue, make up our pot of money that we use to fund our operations, fund disbursements to local governments, Attorney General, DHHS, and then at the end, sweep the rest of that into what is now the People-Centered Funding Plan. But anyway, so I wanted to include FY 19, 20, and 21. FY 19 and 20 was the past oversight body. FY 21 was the first full year of CCB in operation. Licensing and renewal fees, fairly consistent, and agent registration card fees went up quite a bit, but they, being on that 2-year cycle, which is also new, will continue to be cyclical. So it'll go down in FY 22 and then go back up in FY 23. But the two biggest increases are on civil penalties and in time and effort billing. And so on, civil penalties, obviously quite an increase from the year and 2 years prior. It's a little bit inflated. There was a $1 million civil penalty issued that year. And so that makes up obviously over half of the 1.9 million we collected. But I just think in general, and as laid out in the public policy and was the whole point of the CCB, there's been a greater emphasis placed on enforcement and compliance within the industry, and that's why you see an increase. Obviously, that's not a metric of success for us. The more civil penalties we issue, that's not a good thing. That means people are out of compliance, but it is representative of that greater emphasis that we've begun to place on coming into compliance. And then time and effort billing, and I don't know if some of you have heard about this. Obviously, this was a little bit of a growing pains for the industry, as they're the ones who have to pay the bills that come to them. But, the cannabis industry was always supposed to be self-funded. That's how the ballot question was listed. It's how medical marijuana operated as well. So time and effort was always charged from the medical days up into the CCB. When we took over, we just, picked up some of the slack. There was a little bit of an emphasis that we placed on that as well to make sure that that was clear. Our actions, our operations were being billed appropriately for time and effort. And so that's why you see an increase there, and that will continue on going forward. So my last slide then is just looking ahead, a couple things that are on our radar that I think should be on the state's radar as well as federal action and legalization. We know something's going to happen, but trying to guess a congressional timeline is a fool's errand. But we could either see something on banking happening in the near term. It's passed the House a number of times. It is not passed the Senate. It's been folded into defense authorization bills and then removed. So we could see banking legislation passed by itself, or we could see a full rescheduling, full descheduling, or full legalization happen as well. But we're trying to anticipate what's coming down the bend or around the bend and prepare as much as we can. We talked a little bit about, after Senator Tetro's question on the enforcement of the illicit market. And so we want to make sure we have our finger on the pulse of that, and certainly identifying any kind of impact on lost tax revenue as a result. Delta 8 and other synthetic cannabinoids. So, with the Farm Bill and hemp legalization, there's been some issues with utilizing hemp and adulterating it, I guess, into products that are psychoactive and being sold to all ages. And so we have made some advancements last legislative session in protecting against some of those products, but we know we're going to continue to make more movement in that as well. And then the impact of consumption lounges once operational, both on the industry and then on tax revenue for the state. And also what I mentioned is that market stability study. That'll be very important to the industry as a whole going forward on future licensing rounds. So, Chair, thank you. It was a lot very quickly. And I appreciate the opportunity to present that. We can answer any more questions, or we can let tax go.
Thank you for that. Any additional questions on these last two slides? Senator Dennis and then Assemblywoman Anderson.
Just a real quick, it's probably a follow-up, or maybe you even answered it when you answered Senator Tetro's. On the enforcement of the illicit market, do we today have the ability to go after the illicit market better today than we did before we legalized marijuana?
Senator, thanks for the question, and Tyler Klimas for the record. I think some of the pain points, and again, all of this is kind of left to local law enforcement, and I don't want to put words in their mouth or answer for them. A lot of it has to do with, I think, the lack of prosecution on some of this over the years as cannabis has become legal, right? And I don't know if that has eliminated, some of the opportunity to pursue all the way to the end some of the illicit market issues that are going on. Again, I don't want to put words in their mouth. They're the ones that have the boots on the ground. But I mean, I don't think capacity has changed one way or the other, but I think with different factors as a result of legalization in the evolving process, it has changed the way that we're able to go after the illicit market, or we've changed the way the illicit market has been dealt with historically.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you. And thank you, Director Clemens, for being so kind to get to the point on many of these things so quickly. I'm not sure if this question is for you or for Mr. Ginden, but it has to do with the licensure and renewal fees. Is that on a set number, or did we take into consideration inflation with an automatic raising of it with inflation costs, or is it set that this is how much the renewal fee will always be? What is the process for that? And that's based upon conversations we've had the last two meetings, I think, when it comes to inflation. So.
Sure. Assemblywoman, thanks for the question. Tyler Clemens for the record. So the renewal fees, the initial application and the renewal fees are set in statute. And so it's an annual renewal basis, but those amounts don't change because, again, they're set in statute.
So just to make sure as well that if there was to be an adjustment to it, that could be done by the legislative process, or since it was done by initiative petition, would it have to go back to the people? And thank you so much for that clarification.
Sure. Tyler Clemens for the record. It would be done through a legislative session.
Mr. Fernley, I see you unmuting.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to agree with Mr. Klimas that the period by which the initiative petition for enacting the statute regulating marijuana has passed, so the legislature can adjust the fees by legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. All right, so we will go ahead and move on to agenda item number 6, which is the presentation by Department of Taxation on the wholesale tax, retail tax related to cannabis.
Madam Chair, this is Russell Ginden with the Fiscal Analysis Division, and while the Department of Taxation is bringing their stuff up, just wanted to point out and thank Mr. Klimas and his staff for the table 14-page report that begins on page 54 of the packet is actually information that CCB provides on their website, and Director Klimas was kind enough to allow us fiscal staff to prepare this table to include in the packet for the committee members' consideration. And then also, as Mr. Klimas referenced in his presentation, the summary table that was prepared from that 14-page report that's on page 53 of the packet. So since Director Klimas referenced that, I just wanted for the committee members to say that's what was being referenced, is those pages in the packet. And want to thank Mr. Klimas and his staff for working with us to be able to put that information together for the committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that. So Department of Taxation, are you ready?
We are ready.
Yay.
Good afternoon, Chair Neal and committee members. My name is Shelley Hughes, and I'm the Executive Director for the Department of Taxation. I have with me today Melissa Flatley, who's the Chief Deputy Executive Director, and we will be presenting on the taxation of Nevada's cannabis industry. I'm going to turn it over first to Chief Deputy Flatley to begin our presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee. So in our presentation today, Director Hughes and I will present information first on the evolution of the taxes of cannabis through today's present structure. Director Hughes will explain the department's calculation of fair market value of cannabis, which is used in the payment of the wholesale marijuana tax. Director Hughes will also share some information on taxation of products sold in cannabis consumption lounges and the status of regulations that are under development regarding those lounges. Finally, I'll explain how the taxpayers report and pay their tax revenue to the state and how that money is distributed. I'm going to skip over the information on this slide because CCB, we put our slideshow together before we'd seen CCB's slideshow, so they already covered a lot of this background information on marijuana in Nevada. But as far as the tax structure, there have been frequent changes to the tax structure since 2013 when SB 374 implemented its 222 system. And that imposed a 2% excise tax at each sale of medical marijuana, whether by the cultivator, a facility that manufactured marijuana infused products, or the the sale to the consumer. When question 2 was passed, it imposed a 15% excise tax on sales of recreational marijuana by cultivation facilities. It did not change the excise taxes on medical marijuana, however, so it created 2 separate systems of marijuana based on whether it was taxed as medical marijuana or taxed as recreational marijuana. This was addressed in 2017, and SB 487 modified the tax structure by increasing the excise tax on wholesale sales of marijuana that were intended for medical use to 15% from the 2%, and abolished the 2% tax on sales to facilities that produced marijuana-infused products, further imposed a 10% tax on retail sales of marijuana. And that's kind of where we are now. So sales of cannabis are subject to sales tax based on the state rate as well as the local rate. Each retailer of cannabis must file a monthly sales tax return that includes both the sales for adult use and the sales to patient card holders and the required sales tax payment. Then NRS 372A.290 imposes an excise tax on certain wholesale and retail sales of cannabis. The WMT, or wholesale marijuana tax, is imposed at the rate of 15% of the fair market value at wholesale for wholesale sales of cannabis by a medical or adult use cannabis cultivation facility to another cannabis establishment. In 2021, SB 278 exempted transfers by cultivation facilities that transfer cannabis to another cannabis cultivation facility with identical ownership. They're required to file a supplemental return providing details of such transfers, but those transfers are not subject to the wholesale marijuana tax. For each retail sale of cannabis or cannabis products by an adult use cannabis retail store, and soon this will also include a cannabis consumption lounge, an excise tax is imposed at the rate of 10% of the sales price of the cannabis or cannabis product. And this is called the RMT, or retail marijuana tax. There are a few exemptions from the RMT. First, medical cannabis is exempt from the 10% RMT. And if a retail store has an agreement with an independent cannabis lounge and sells cannabis or cannabis products to the lounge, those sales must be reported to the department, but will be exempt from the RMT. The cannabis lounge, the independent cannabis lounge, will be responsible for payment of the RMT. As I mentioned, the wholesale marijuana tax is based on the calculation of fair market value, and I will now have Director Hughes explain that process.
So Shelley Hughes, Executive Director for the Department of Taxation, for the record. In 2016, with the passage of the initiative petition question 2, a 15% wholesale excise tax on the fair market value at wholesale cannabis was created. The initiative petition also gave the department the authority to adopt regulations regarding the procedures to establish the fair market value at wholesale of cannabis. So what is the fair market value and how is it determined? NAC 453D.045 defines fair market value as the value established by the department based on the price that a buyer would pay to a seller in an arm's length transaction for cannabis in the wholesale market. How does the department calculate the fair market value? Well, we look at raw data on 9 categories from wholesale transfers reported in the seed to sale tracking, which is metric, for a 6-month period. The most recent data came from transfers on April 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2021. The 9 categories of cannabis that the department looks at are small or popcorn bud, and that is reported in pounds. Cannabis flowers or bud, reported in pounds. Cannabis leaves, trim, or shake, which is reported in pounds. Immature, not flowering, cannabis plants. Wet whole plants, which are reported in pounds. Seeds, which are reported in units. And pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes or joints, reported in units. Unsaleable flower approved for extraction, which is reported in pounds. And unsaleable trim approved for extraction, reported in pounds. After the department pulls the data for metric, we remove certain transfers that aren't considered arm length transactions. And those transfers include internal transfers from vertically integrated companies, transfers that are exempt from the wholesale tax, which include tribal, cultivation, production, or dispensary transfers, and any transfers that include keywords such as samples, displays, internal, promos, testers, or trials. The department must also take that data and manually calculate the prices per pound or per unit so that the prices are standardized. The department removes any records with standardized prices less than 15% or more than 500% from the previous fair market value determination, as these are considered outliers. The department then takes the remaining data transfers and determines the median sales price for each category. The median sales price becomes the fair market value, and the 15% wholesale excise tax, which, as Melissa explained, is referred to as WMT, is then imposed on the fair market value at wholesale of cannabis for each category. A document is drafted with the department's determination of the fair market value, and the WMT return is revised to include the new fair market values, and both forms are posted at the department's website. In your packet that you received, we included a copy of the most recent determination as an exhibit, if you would like to see what information is included. This determination is from the most recent fair market calculation, which began on January 1st, 2022. The next determination of fair market value at wholesale rates will take effect July 1st, 2022, and will be based on wholesale transfers made between October 1st, 2021 through March 31st, 2022. So that brings up a question about what trends the data reveals. Analyzing the most recent data, the department has made the following observations. After generally declining for several years, the two largest product categories, which are small bud and flower, have seen prices begin to rise over the past year. The fair market value for the trim category has barely changed since the July 2021 determination, while the fair market value for immature plants, seeds, and pre-rolls did not change at all. The wet whole plant category increased from July, but is still below January 2021 levels. Flower and trim approved for extraction also increased somewhat from July, but remain below 2020 price levels. The department has every fair market value determination posted on our website, so if you'd like to observe the trends from July 1st, 2017 to the present, you may do so. So that brings me to the last item on this slide, which is pending regulations. The department currently has a pending regulation, LCB file number R108-20, that contains provisions that set forth the method of calculating the fair market value at wholesale of cannabis. These provisions are substantially similar to the method that was previously adopted by the department in the context of adult use cannabis in NAC 453D.236. But with the enactment of AB 533 from the 2019 legislative session, the department retained the authority to calculate the fair market value at wholesale. And as a result, we had to pursue rulemaking to transfer the language from NAC 453D.236 to NAC 372A, which is the chapter that contains provisions regarding cannabis excise taxes. This regulation was adopted by the Nevada Tax Commission on March 7, 2022, and is awaiting to be heard by the next legislative commission. Next slide. So in Director Klimas's presentation, he discussed cannabis consumption lounges. What is Department of Taxation's role in this area? Well, the department's role is to collect the retail excise tax, which is called the RMT, on any cannabis or cannabis product retail sale, and to collect any sales tax associated with those sales, as well as collect the sales tax on the sale of tangible personal property made by a consumption lounge. Assembly Bill 341 from last legislative session contains several sections that pertain to the collection of taxes by a cannabis consumption lounge. Section 25 of the bill provides that a retail cannabis consumption lounge can obtain from the adult use retail store to which it is attached single-use cannabis products for purposes of resale, and cannabis or cannabis products for the purposes of producing ready-to-consume cannabis products. When reselling to customers, the lounge must pay the RMT as well as the sales tax. The lounge will need to register with the department for a sales tax permit. Section 27 of the bill allows for an independent cannabis consumption lounge to enter into a contract with one or more adult use cannabis retail stores to sell to an independent consumption lounge single-use cannabis products for the purposes of resale, and cannabis or cannabis products for the purposes of producing ready-to-consume cannabis products. When reselling to consumers, the lounge must pay the retail marijuana tax, or RMT, as well as the sales tax. The lounge will need to register with the department for a sales tax permit. And Section 31 of the bill adds a cannabis consumption lounge as a taxpayer in NRS Chapter 372A and requires the lounge to remit the 10% excise tax to the department. The department is currently working on a regulation which amends NAC 372A to add language relating to a cannabis consumption lounge's obligation of the payment of the tax and provides the procedure for the cannabis lounges to collect and remit the excise tax on retail sales. This regulation is in the early stages of rulemaking, and the language is currently being drafted and reviewed. I'll turn it back over to Chief Deputy Flatley for the next slide.
Thank you. So we'll wrap up with some information that will segue into Fiscal's presentation of the revenue tables following our presentation. Taxpayer payments, as I've said, are due monthly, and a return is required from the taxpayer even if there is no tax due. So they need to file a zero return. The department does accept cash payments for both WMT and RMT, the wholesale and retail marijuana taxes. Taxpayers must make an appointment with the office where they want to make their payment. And on average, combining our northern and southern offices, the department has approximately 170 appointments each quarter to accept those cash payments. After the payments come in, they're distributed in accordance with 372A.290 and are distributed first to the Cannabis Compliance Board and to local governments in an amount that's determined by the board to pay the costs of the board and the local governments in carrying out the provisions of both NRS chapters 678C and 678D of the NRS. Up to $5 million can be distributed to all local governments to cover their costs. As of July 1st, 2021, any remaining funds are deposited to the State Education Fund. I apologize, I made a typo on the slide that's included in your materials, and I didn't refer to the current effective version of NRS 372A.290. Prior versions of that statute had deposited excess funds to the state distributive school account, but that's currently into the State Education Fund. Chair Neal, this completes the department's prepared presentation, and Director Hughes and I are both available to answer your questions.
Thank you for that. So Russell, were you going to go over those slides next? I would like you to.
Yes, Madam Chair, with your direct, unless you wanted to take questions for Department of Taxation first before I proceeded.
I want to do it all together because don't your slides correlate?
Yes, there be a supplement to the information that's been presented.
Yeah, just go ahead and present.
By CCB and Taxation.
Yeah, present the slides.
Okay. So with that, Madam Chair, then I will share my screen and bring slides up. And while I'm attempting to do that, I will apologize in advance here that I think this is when reviewing the packet last night, I actually realized I forgot to include these tables in the packet. And so they are in Nellis outside the packet that are now being displayed on your screen. And again, for the record, Russell Ginnan with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And so let me try to blow these up a little bit. So I apologize for not having them in the packet, but they're in Nellis outside the packet. And so I don't have a lot to say with regard to these tables and charts in terms of insight or commentary, other than what we wanted to do is for the members of the committee is take information that's actually reported by the Department of Taxation. So they have available on their website for both the 15% wholesale tax and the 10% retail tax. They're reporting monthly what the actual collections are, and they're putting those reports up by fiscal year. So here, working with the data that the Department of Taxation reports for each fiscal year, we've pulled it together into one table. So you can see the monthly amounts here statewide in table 1 for the 15% wholesale excise tax. And it's been pointed out here, and I'll just reiterate that this is the tax that's on the cultivation, the back end of sort of the marijuana production cycle, as it goes from cultivation up to retail, or cultivation to production and then up to retail. And so this 15% wholesale tax applies to the cultivated products that are subject to the tax, whether it's for medical or adult use. And so here you can see the monthly statewide collections. And then on the right-hand side here is the 10% retail. And I'm using cannabis. And for those that have been with marijuana since its inception, going from medical and adult use retail, and we have started out using the term marijuana, but now more in statute, we use the term cannabis. So I'll apologize for myself and probably any of the other presenters that we commingle the use of cannabis and marijuana when referring to these two excise taxes. So the 10% is, as was just explained, at the retail side, but only on the adult use, not medical. So just keep that in mind, that the tax bases are different between the wholesale tax and the retail side, but the sales tax does attach to both medical and adult use. So that's just to get the distinctions, again, had already been presented. So I don't plan on spending a lot of time going through this. On the second page, you can see we summarized it by fiscal. So you can see the growth in this tax. And that's why I'll get to the charts here. And it gets hard to make commentary or insights because although this industry is maturing over the last several years, it's still somewhat of a new industry. So in terms of, you've seen the number of years that it's been in place to have monthly taxes paid. And so you don't know what's driving both the wholesale side and the retail side, because it can be, you're having additional licensees come online, and then that in relation to the demand by the residents of Nevada and or visitors that can come to Nevada. And let's throw in a pandemic there in that too, in terms of that can affect the numbers. But you can now see that in FY21, which would have been in that pandemic period, the 15% wholesale generated around approximately $65.6 million. And then the 10% generated around $92.1 million. And I'll, again, just be redundant here to point out that the 15% wholesale is the funds for that tax, as we point out, they go in the fund CCB's budget along with the license fees. And then any excess is required to be transferred to the state education fund now. Prior to that, it was required to be transferred to the state distributive account. And then, but the 10%, when that was put in place at the end of the 2017 session, for the first 2 years, the 10% retail excess tax proceeds went to the state rainy day fund. Then they were dedicated to the state distributive account for K-12 education. And then as we moved over from the Nevada plan to the people-centered funding plan, those proceeds are now go into the state education. So I just wanted to be redundant there by making those points. So then table 2 is just showing you the 15% wholesale excise tax for statewide again, but Clark County, Washoe County, and then all other counties. And the reason, this is how it's currently reported by the Department of Taxation. And you can see the note at the bottom of the table is why we're reporting Clark and Washoe and then all other, even though if you looked at the notes, there's several counties that there are licensed cultivation facilities operating, and thus the tax will be getting remitted and paid to the Department of Taxation. But taxation cannot disclose individual taxpayer information and or report the numbers in a way that would allow one to potentially infer someone else's results because they know their own results. So because of the sort of the nature of the current licenses in these other counties, taxation has to roll it into this all other counties category. But we just thought we would provide the information. And again, this information is being reported on Department of Taxation's website. We're just bringing it together here, working with Department of Taxation staff to show you by month and then by fiscal year in terms of being compiled. Table 3 is just showing you the 10% excise tax, retail excise tax. And again, showing you the statewide total, and then Clark and Washoe and all other counties, and the reasoning is the same for reporting all their counties. Perhaps sometime in the future, the Department of Taxation will get to a point where they might be able to report additional counties, but it's just too tenuous now with regards to reporting them and worrying about disclosure issues. So then I don't plan on going through a lot of them. I'll just tell you charts 1A through 1D are showing you the 15% wholesale and the 10% retail for statewide, Clark, Washoe, and all other counties. So you can see chart 1A. And this just is the graphical way of displaying the data that's in the table. And you look at them, and if you would ask me to make any observations, clearly, I think you'd expect, even though the 10% rate is 5% less than the 15%, but right, the 15% is occurring at the wholesale level. So then if you're going to have, as it goes from cultivation up to retail and or from cultivation to production up to retail, you're going to have, right, markups. This is no different than any other industry as things move through the process of production, manufacturing, and that. You'll have markups. And so then the price, and then the 15% wholesale tax, in a sense, it's a cost of doing business at that cultivation site. So it's going to get rolled up into the retail price to the extent that the market will allow them to push that wholesale tax on to the retail customer. So it shouldn't be a surprise then that the 10% tax is more than the 15%. But as you look at this, you can get times when months where the 15% is very close to, or even if you look at some of the markets, gets above. Well, that can be the timing of when they're cultivating the plant and harvesting it, and then the tax is being due at the wholesale level versus then what's occurring at the retail level in terms of customers coming in purchase. So that's the one observation that I did want to make as you walk through and look at these charts. And then also it's going to depend on the number of licenses of cultivators in the markets that are being reported here in relation to whether or not they have also retail adult use marijuana. And so when you get to the all other counties, that's where the chart can get very interesting. Well, that's because if you go look at the slides that are out there that we summarize from the information reported by the CCB, well, there are some counties that have cultivation but don't have retail and vice versa. So when you roll up to all other counties, this becomes a hard chart to make any interpretations of. So, but you do have the statistical information of what's being generated. And then just chart 2 is showing you, allows you graphically to see the 15% wholesale statewide, as well as the 3 markets that can be reported. That is Clark, Washoe, and all other counties, just to give you sort of visual representation of what that tax looks like. And then finally, chart 3 is the 10% wholesale, 10% retail cannabis excise tax. And again, just showing the markets and allowing you to see what's going on for those markets in relation to the statewide total that you see. And with that, Madam Chair, those were the remarks that I wanted to make, and appreciate the Department of Taxation reporting this information on their website and allowing us to compile it into these charts and tables. And if, based on the chair's directions, we keep them updated within Fiscal. And if there's interest, they can be continually be provided to the members of this committee throughout this interim, if there's interest in that. And so with that, I can answer any questions that the chair or the members of the committee may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gendon. So what we'll do is open up have members ask questions to you, Department of Tax, and if there's, I don't know if CCB is still on, if there's a role in addressing any of those questions. But I know Assemblyman Yeager has a question, so I'll start with him first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple questions on the tax side, and I think these will probably both be for taxation. But in looking at Mr. Gendon's chart, chart 1D, so I just noticed there was a really big spike in the all other counties for the 10% retail excise tax in May of 2020, there was a huge spike. And then for the 15% wholesale, there was a really large spike in January 2021. And I just wondered if there was any sort of explanation for that. Was that just the opening of dispensaries or the opening of a grow operation? Because it just seems like those two numbers were like really out of proportion for the rest of the months for those two taxes.
Thank you, Assemblyman Yeager, for the question. Shelley Hughes for the record. I'm not exactly sure what those spikes may be due to. However, differences can be due to several different adjustments during prior periods that happen as a result of amended returns or audit findings. So those spikes could be due to anything. One taxpayer may not have reported sales in one quarter and reported all their sales in another. So it's really hard to tell.
Okay, thank you. And then just, I wanted to go back really quickly to the fair market value calculation that you talked about on the 15% tax. And so if I'm looking at it right, it's the chart. I don't think you went over it, but you provided this chart that kind of gave highs and lows and then the median price. So I don't know which slide this is, but for instance, I'm looking at it. And so for small bud, the maximum was almost $8,000 a pound, and the minimum was $250 a pound with a median of about $1,700. So kind of a two-part question. First, on this chart, did these only reflect the arm's length transactions, or do these reflect all of the transactions before you weeded out what you would consider to be not arm's length transactions?
Thank you, Assemblyman Yeager. Shelley Hughes for the record. Our economist has provided this chart and does so every time we release the information. But I do believe that all the information has been removed from the data set that aren't arm length transactions before this is put together.
Thank you. And then just the follow up on that is there's obviously a huge difference. Like if you look at flour, 11,500 a pound versus 2,500 a pound on the low end. So my question there was, are you able to offer any commentary on why there's such a large spread? The two thoughts that occurred to me was either maybe the demand was really high on that product at some point and the supply wasn't there, or maybe there's just higher demand for what is perceived to be a higher quality product. So just wondered if you had insight into why there's such a big difference between the high and lows, particularly on the small bud and the flour.
Shelley Hughes for the record again. I do not have insight on that. I could do some further research with my staff and we can get back to you.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you, Chair Neal.
Thank you for that. Any additional questions from members? Assemblyman Hafen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, thank you to Department of Taxation and Fiscal staff for putting this all together. I know that, as Vice Chair Yeager stated, the fair market value seems very, very difficult to calculate. I would guess it's based on THC values of why we have such a discrepancy in the max value and the min value, but I would love to also hear back on that to see what that is about. Do you know what percentage of the wholesale has moved into the vertically integrated category that the Cannabis Compliance Board was mentioning versus kind of their own separate entity?
Thank you, Assemblyman Hafen. I'm not sure if CCB is still online. They may be able to answer the question better than I do. But we have seen more and more vertically integrated businesses. So it does become harder to calculate the fair market value. Those transactions aren't considered arm length transactions, so we have to remove those from the data set. But I do know, Tyler said in his presentation, there are 761 licenses. So if he's still available, he may be able to further answer that question.
Steve.
Thank you, Tyler Klimas, for the record. Thanks, Director Hughes, and for the question. I don't have the percentage, so what we'd be looking for is the percentage of cultivation facilities that are part of a vertically integrated operation. We could likely pull that data to get you those exact numbers. I don't have it offhand. I would add, though, just as another element to why we see or why we think we see some of these huge discrepancies between maxes and mins too, is there's other things that when flower and small bud specifically, if it was to fail testing, it can still, while it can't be sold in its current state, it can be sold to like a production facility, which then would turn it into a distillate, right? And go through a process which would kill any kind of bacteria or any kind of pesticide that was already on there. And so that could also explain, and that does also explain some of these max and mins as well. But we're happy to look and see if we can pull that data for you.
Thank you. I know it's obviously a lot of information and looks like a tough task for Department of Taxation to try to figure out the fair market value for these vertically integrated businesses. So I do appreciate that. And then the other question that I have, and Madam Chair, tell me to stop anytime, is in regard to the county tax. I saw that was in our backup, and maybe I'm premature here. But I'm curious how the county taxes are working in regards to wholesale when they're being shipped from one county to another county.
Shelley Hughes for the record. So we only collect the state excise tax, the wholesale excise tax. I'm not sure how the county imposes taxes on those transfers. So I'm not sure I can fully answer your question.
Madam Chair, I don't know, this is Russell Ginden with the Fiscal Analysis Division. I don't know if I'll be able to fully and accurately answer some of Hiven's questions, but I'll provide the following information to just for all the members. So someone Haven is referring to in the 2017 legislation wasn't required in the ballot question, but the legislature gave local governments the authority to impose up to a 3% tax on the gross revenue. I'm not going to get into nitty-gritty details, so I'm summarizing here. Up to 3% on the gross revenue at the cultivation level, up to 3% at the production level, and up to 3% at the retail level. And so we're in the process of trying to do some research on that as fiscal staff, but that tax is in some sense on the gross revenue. So you can say that functions like these excise taxes, but the excise tax is when there's a sale, then the tax occurs to this, and then it's at the 15% wholesale at the state level. It attaches to this median price that's being set by taxation as the fair market price, not what the price it actually would have sold for or transferred at. So it would seem to me, possibly as someone having that, then it would be, well, what was the gross revenue for the tax reporting period that entity in the county generated, possibly independent of whether they sold it to somebody across the county line? It would be revenue that they got from selling that product. And then they would attach whatever rate up to the 3% that the local government. And that would be right. The counties have that authority and the cities have that authority, but you're not double taxing it, right? That you're either in the unincorporated county or you're in a city or have the ability to impose these 3% gross revenue taxes. So again, I know someone that doesn't totally answer your question, but hopefully it provides some information, probably that since it's based on gross revenue, then I would imagine that entity, if they're getting revenue from selling the product, it would then be subject to the tax in the county in which the facility is operating and generating the revenue.
And thank you very much for that. And just, Madam Chair, indulge me with a follow-up.
No, I mean, go ahead. I know this is of interest to you and I want you to get it sorted.
With the cannabis industry moving towards the vertically integrated, and there's a lot of cultivation in Nye County, and then it's being transported to where most of the consumption is, which is in Clark County. And so my question then becomes is, are they then required to calculate the gross revenue, even though it's not an actual transfer when it's vertically integrated, based on the fair market value, or not? And I'm not sure that we have an answer today, but that is something that I would like to look into further.
Again, for the record, Russell again with Fiscal Analysis, Summer Haven. We have started that research, and I think you're correct in your statement that at this point in time, fiscal staff isn't able to provide. What we're finding, the ordinances that are being put in place by local governments for their up to 3% gross revenue taxes do have different structures, and thus it's not clear to us as to exactly whether it's picking up transfers versus sales. I can't remember, but there is one entity that actually has an ordinance that's tied to taxation fair market value calculation. So just here this afternoon, as Solomon, that's all I can say is we're working on that research project, and we're finding that the answer that we can provide to you this afternoon is it depends. And we'll get that, once we get that figured out, we can provide that to the members of the committee. And Madam Chair, I'll also point out that we're working with the Department of Taxation, as was pointed out, every 6 months, they're doing this determination that lasts for a 6-month tax period for this fair market value determination. So we're working with taxation to compile all those 6 months together into a tabular and or charted format. And that is something that can be provided to the committee at a later date once we're done with that. And in some sense that would allow, I think, the members of the committee and like Assemblyman Yeager's question about, well, how does that look? What are the number of observations over each of those 6-month periods? How is the min and the max and the median moving around? Because this is a unique tax where you just don't attach a rate to the price. You've got to have this intermediate calculation of fair market value, but using historical information to determine the, in a sense, the effective tax rate, because the effective tax rate is the 15% tax rate times the fair market price for the type of cannabis product that Ms. Hughes went through. And just for reference, so that all the members know, currently, the reason that the Nevada has this structure for the 15% wholesale tax is it came out of the ballot question. And so as was brought up we've stuck with it for 3 years, but we're now past that time. So if the legislature did choose to do so, they could make modifications to the structure. And Colorado is using this structure. So as Colorado being one of the marijuana markets that was up and operating in place, the drafters of the petition that for the ballot question chose the structure and then it came through in the ballot question. So I just wanted to have that historical reference point. And then finally, since I have the mic, Madam Chair, I'll offer a little bit of hopefully additional information to Solomon Yeager for those spikes. I don't know either, but I will offer to keep in mind that, right, Clark and Washoe, look at the charts. They're the bigger people. So they are not going to be
Oh, he froze. Mr. Gendon.
and it would be very hard for
Russell, you got to backtrack. You literally froze mid-sentence.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, it just told me
you literally have to start out with, I think I could share insight to Yeager.
Okay, so and I'll try and make it quicker right, all other counties is a much smaller set of licensees in these different counties and markets. So compared to like Clark and Washoe, which are more mature and stable. So having a new licensee come online in Clark and Washoe wouldn't have the order of magnitude effect as you might see in that all other county reporting category. So I think that could be some of what's driving it, is to go, oh, did somebody come online? But I'm also wondering, when you see a one-time spike like that and it's not sustainable, I'm just gonna, it's pure conjecture, some of them, that, but as Director Klimas stated, and they're working with Department of Taxation when licensees come forward to make sure you're trued up on your taxes. So just over all my years of working with data, when you see spikes in data, as was stated by Director Hughes, hey, did we have an audit, or CCB said, hey, you got to get good with taxation on your taxes. And I'm not saying that's what it is, but that's where my mind would go, is when you see spikes. Okay, yeah, it's one-time things occurring, either because the taxpayer decided to, oh, I got to true up, or when they went before CCB said you got to true up, or taxation caught them through an audit. So thus there's multiple periods being reported in that 1 month in terms of the taxes. So I just wanted to offer that, and Director Klimas and Director, I'm full of it if they so choose. But that's just from historically looking at taxes. That's where my hypothesis would go.
Okay. And I know I'm going to have some questions on what you just talked about, the whole length of it. But Senator Tatro.
I just had a quick question on the all other counties portion. Does that also include, I didn't see anything for the tribes. Do they report in a similar fashion?
Shelley Hughes for the record. We don't collect tax from the tribes. We have agreements or compacts with the tribes, and Tyler can speak more to this. With CCB has entered into agreements with several of the tribes, and they are required to impose the same tax rate or higher that the state imposes, but they collect the tribal tax on those sales that occur on tribal lands.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Interesting.
And just for clarity, this is again, Russell Gideon, Director, and they retain it correctly. Right, yeah, that they don't collect it and then give it to the state. They're collecting it and retaining it. I just want to make sure that.
So let me ask you this, because Mr. Gendon and Ms. Hughes, so they retain it. So it doesn't matter if an outside resident goes to, or is a resident of the Clark County and then goes to the tribe and then comes back. So the nexus, everything stays.
Shelley Hughes for the record. Chair Neal, yes. The sale occurs where the transfer of the product occurs. So if a Nevada resident goes onto tribal land, purchases cannabis, the tribal tax is imposed on that sale. So
Let me ask you this though. Were they a part of the consumption lounge bill, or is that, I don't know if I should ask Jaeger that. But are tribes gonna have the consumption lounges as well? Or were they excluded?
Shelley Hughes for the record. I don't believe that the tribal governments were included in the cannabis consumption lounge, but I'm sure Assemblyman Yeager or Director Klimas can address that better.
Chair, I could address it if you want. The tribal was already operating a consumption lounge before we had the state bill over at NUWU, so they are not expressly included, and because their sovereignty, they can kind of do as they wish in this space. But beyond that, I don't know if the compacts touch on that, or if they're going to be touching upon it at some point. That's beyond my expertise. But Assembly Bill 341 just had to do with the state regulated under the CCB.
Okay. And so just really quickly to go back to the conversation around the local jurisdictions and this research project, are we including, because I've always been curious, number one, about the internal processes on how the local jurisdictions report to the Department of Taxation. And I've also been super curious because they typically have a line item in their budget for that up to 3%. But I've also been curious about what they spend it on. So in that research project, when you're asking these local jurisdictions, can we also find out, I want to know what their collections are. I've been curious about their collections because it's always been outside of their general fund and they've always used it as additional money to do as they wish. But I'm very interested in what their current appropriation for the money is for. Like, what are they applying it to within their jurisdiction? Because I always want to know where the money is when they come to the state and say, well, I can't pay for this service. And I think it will be very informative for 2023 to know where their marijuana money is going when they start saying we don't have money to pay for services. And that's my own selfish government affairs want to know.
Well, Madam Chair, this is again, Russell again with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And so I'll just assume here that you sort of expanded our.
I did.
Because we were mainly, and that's fine. We were mainly trying to look at what were they doing in their ordinances, because these are purely, and Ms. Hughes can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no interaction between the Department of Taxation and local governments with regards to this up to 3%. It is basically a license fee that the local governments can choose to impose, and they can impose it on all 3 levels, 2 levels, 1 level, up to the 3%. And then they do that by ordinance. So then they're administering and collecting that tax on the gross revenue at the local level. And then I'm going from memory, but I don't believe we put any restrictions on it, on what they could use it for. And thus it, in my terminology, it would be like general fund revenue, right? That they could put it in their general fund budget, but then they could also earmark it or dedicate it for other things, because I don't believe we placed any restrictions on what they could use the proceeds from imposing the up to 3% taxes, license taxes at the cultivation, production, and retail levels. But we will, our project, because we were mainly trying to look at their ordinances and seeing what they were doing, but we can reach out to the local governments that are imposing these taxes to tell us what it is that they are generating from them and then what they're being used for.
Thank you for that. And then I just had one question for Ms. Hughes on the consumption lounge piece. When you were talking about that there was the cannabis product, you're taxing the cannabis product that's being used within the consumption lounge. And I guess, does the tax itself mimic you know how we did the vape bill, and the vape bill dealt with the components of the tangible thing that was either being used, created, it even included signage. Does that cannabis product excise that you're collecting mimic that vape tax at all in terms of what it touches?
Chair Neal, thank you for the question. That is a good question. So the retail marijuana tax is strictly on cannabis and cannabis products. So it wouldn't touch the accessories. So those type of things would be taxed for sales tax purposes. Cannabis Consumption Lounge will be responsible both for the retail marijuana tax, or the RMT, and sales tax on those type of tangible personal property.
Okay. Because that it just sounded like it was kind of like the vaping language. All right. So any additional questions? No? Okay. So then thank you for the presentation. This was really good information. Now we can move on to agenda item number 7, which is the presentation on sales and use tax rates. So this is a follow-up from our prior meetings. We were trying to, finish getting information out that we weren't able to cover. So who's presenting on this one? Mr. Nakamoto? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division of Legislative Counsel Bureau. On page 81 of the packet for the meeting, which is the page number is page 79, but it's page 81 of the PDF, begins table 1 for agenda item number 7. And hold on, let me bring that up on my screen real quick. All right, you should be able to see table 1, the overview of state and local sales tax rates imposed under current law in Nevada. And this is just more of a general view of the sales tax, going back to the last meeting where we talked about the issues regarding the sales tax. And so to walk through this table, I'm going to first go through all of the columns to explain just the information that is here. The first column you can see there is the area where the rate is imposed. So you can see for the first few it's statewide, but because this table is going to deal with a lot of the local tax rates, it will talk about the county in which the rate is imposed. And all of these rates that we're talking about, these optional rates, are county rates. There are no rates that are imposed at a rate that's smaller than a county, for example, a city. So it's either a statewide rate, as you can see for the first 4 there, or county rates as I go through the rest of the table. The purpose is the reason why the rate is being imposed. The current rate that's being imposed, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. The statutory authority for it is either the NRS citation, or there is a citation of a statute from the statutes of Nevada. And as I go through a few of these, I'll talk about this. The next column is the date a rate was first imposed. And it's not necessarily the rate that is being imposed, but the first time that a rate under this authority was imposed either at the state or the local level by that authority. And I'll talk about a couple of examples of that. And then the last column is the actual collections from that particular component of the rate for the last actual fiscal year, FY 2021. This is information that was obtained from the Department of Taxation. And this is information they always put up on their website, and we are appreciative to Director Hughes and her staff for putting that information together. So for the first group that you can see there under the header statewide rates, this is pretty self-explanatory. These are the ones that are imposed in all 17 counties. You have the state general fund rate, the 2% rate. Mr. Fernley talked about the Sales and Use Tax Act of 1955 at the last meeting. That is the authority under which this rate is imposed. And again, it goes to the state general fund. And it was originally put into place under Senate Bill 171 of the 1955 session. The next 2 components I guess I can talk about together, the basic city county relief tax, also known as the BCCRT, and the supplemental city county relief tax, the SCCRT. You can see that the BCCRT is 0.5%. The SCCRT is 1.75%. Those have been imposed in this state since July 1st, 1981. It was AB 369 of the 1981 session that made these mandatory taxes to be imposed in all 17 counties. Under current law, the distribution of this tax, there is a 1.75% commission that is retained for the state general fund to pay for the costs for the Department of Taxation of collecting and administering the tax. And then the remainder of the proceeds go to the local government tax distribution account for distribution to cities, counties, and special and enterprise districts under the consolidated tax distribution, which is why when we note the name there, you see the letters CTX or CTAX. So these are 2 of the major revenue sources for the CTAX, which we will not be getting into today, obviously. And then the last part of the statewide rate is the local school support tax, or the LSST. That has been imposed in this state since July 1st of 1967, and is currently imposed at a rate of 2%, or sorry, 2.6%. with the proceeds going to the state education fund for K-12 education. And this is one of the instances where that date that a rate was first imposed matters, because under the original provisions putting the LSST in place, it was Senate Bill 15 of the 1967 session. It was put into place at a rate of 1%. The legislature has on several occasions increased that rate, most recently during the 2009 session, where it was raised to the current rate of 2.6%. And so when you add all of those together, you get a combined statewide rate of 6.85%. And so that is the rate that is imposed as just the base rate in all 17 counties. But as we've gone through and we've talked about this, there are a lot of counties that have their own option rates that are authorized under special or certain statutes, or there are special or local acts that have been approved by the legislature in past sessions that allow one or more counties to impose a rate. So you can see on this page, there are 4 separate local option rates that are imposed in Carson City. There are 3 that are imposed in Churchill County. On the next page, I'm going to highlight the 6 that are imposed in Clark County, since that is where the bulk of the taxable sales are and may be of the most relevance to the community. The first one that you can see there is for flood control, that it is imposed at a rate of 0.25% pursuant to NRS 543.600. That particular part of statute was put into place pursuant to Assembly Bill 169 of the 1985 session, and it allows a county whose population is 700,000 or more to impose a rate of up to 0.25% for the purpose of a flood control district. So the proceeds from this rate go to the Clark County Regional Flood Control District. The next one is, you can see listed there is the purpose is mass transit and air quality at a rate of 0.5%. That is imposed in Clark County pursuant to NRS 377A.020. That particular section of NRS has 4 different reasons why a county can impose a particular rate for a particular purpose. And I'm not going to get into all of those for this, but one of the purposes is for mass transit or air quality or a combination of those purposes. So Clark County is imposing the maximum 0.5% rate that they can under that statute, with the mass transit portions going to the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada, and the air quality portion retained by Clark County for use for its Division of Air Quality. The next one is the Southern Nevada Water Authority, which there's a rate of 0.25% imposed in Clark County pursuant to NRS 377B.100, which allows any county to impose a rate for certain infrastructure purposes. The maximum rate that can be imposed in most of the counties is 0.25%, which is what Clark County is imposing. And the proceeds, as you can see there, go to the Southern Nevada Water Authority. The next 2 are for county police support. The first is the Clark County Sales and Use Tax Act of 2005. This is the one that colloquially gets referred to as More Cops, that was originally approved by the legislature in Assembly Bill 418 of the 2005 session. And you can see that that is imposed at a rate of 0.3%. The second one is the rate of 0.1% that is imposed under the Clark County Crime Prevention Act of 2016. This was Assembly Bill 1 of the 30th special session back in October of 2016. This is the special session where the legislature considered and approved the project that we now know today as Allegiant Stadium. And then the last one that you can see there is listed as education programs. The legislature in Assembly Bill 309 of the 2019 session gave any county the authority to impose a rate of 0.25% for a number of purposes that were outlined in that bill, one of which being for the support of education within the county. The Clark County Commission did approve an ordinance based on that authority at a rate of 0.125%, and that rate took effect on January 1st, 2020. And so that is the set of local option rate that gets Clark County to their current rate of 8.375%. So continuing down this list, you can see Douglas County has a rate. Elko, Lander, Lincoln, and Lyon all have their own rate under 377B, the infrastructure section, and you can see the various purposes that they are using it for. On the next page, you can see Nye County has 2, Pershing County has 1, Story County has 3, Washoe County has 5. You can see that they have a 377B rate that is listed there for flood control and public safety. I mentioned when I was talking about Clark County's 377B rate that most of the counties have the ability to impose a rate under this this section of NRS at a rate of 0.25%. The exception is Washoe County. Their authority is only to impose a rate of up to 0.125%, and so they are imposing the maximum. The next one listed there is the Local Government Tax Act of 1991. That was Assembly Bill 104 of the 1991 session that gave certain counties the ability to increase or to impose a sales tax rate of 0.25%. There was legislation in the next session that took away the authority for many of the counties to impose a rate under that act. But Washoe and I believe Churchill County retained their ability to impose that rate. So Clark County or Washoe County is still imposing that rate. The next one is for mass transit at a rate of 0.375% pursuant to NRS 377A.020 that goes to the Regional Transportation Commission of Washoe County. And then you can see a special act from 1997 for the retract train trench project of 0.125% that went into effect in April of 1999. And then a rate of 0.54% that is imposed for capital projects for the school district that came out of legislation that was approved during the 2015 session that authorized the imposition or the placement of a ballot question for the imposition of one or more taxes. The committee that was formed as a result of that legislation chose to place a ballot question on the ballot in 2016, imposing a rate of 0.54% for sales tax, and that was approved. So that rate took effect on April 1st, 2017. And then below that, you can see White Pine has 4 different rates. The only one I'm going to highlight on there is the second one for school capital improvements pursuant to NRS 374A.010, which gives certain counties the ability to impose an additional sales and use tax rate for capital improvements for their school district, as long as they've met other conditions. And White Pine County is the only county that is currently imposing this rate. So I just thought I would point that out there. The next few pages here are notes for the table. We go through and explain a lot of the history behind the rates, the statutory citations, and so on. And I'm not going to go through all of those. What I will do is move to page 85, which is page 87 of the PDF, to table 2. And basically it takes all of that information and it digests it into, you can now see the individual rates by each county as well as the total rate. So the columns from left to right, you have the 2% rate that is the state general fund rate, the 1.7 or the 0.5% and the 1.75% BCCRT and SCCRT that go to the consolidated tax distribution, the LSST that goes to the state education fund, and those are all of the components that are imposed in all 17 counties. And then moving on to the left or to the right of that, you have all of the local option rates. NRS 374A is that school capital improvement rate that is only imposed in White Pine County. 377A are the various purposes that are outlined in that section, of which you can see that there are 7 counties imposing a rate there. 377B are the infrastructure rates that can be imposed by ordinance in counties. And you can see that a rate of that magnitude or for under that authority is being imposed in 11 of the 17 counties. 377D is the rate that was authorized by the legislature in 2019 for the various purposes, of which Clark County is the only one imposing that rate at the 0.125% that you can see there. NRS Chapter 543 is the flood control rate that in statute is only given to the authority is only given to Clark County or a county whose population is 700,000 or more. And so you can see Clark County is the only one that is listed there. And then special acts are voter approved. If the legislature passes a special act that allows one or more counties to impose a rate, that's listed there. And you can see 7 of them are there. And then that adds up to the total rate. And you can see on this table that 13 of the 17 counties have a rate that is higher than the statewide mandated rate of 6.85%. Esmeralda, Eureka, Humboldt, and Mineral counties are the only counties that are not imposing a local option rate. So moving on, the next page basically takes all of that information from table 2 and puts it into a chart so you can see the components and then how they all add up to the total rates. And I won't go through that because it's basically just taking the information in the previous table and displaying it in a different form. On table 3 on page 87 of the packet, these are a list of local sales and use tax rates that are authorized or codified under current law, but that are not currently being imposed. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, just to let you know that this information is there. With respect to the first 2, it's a case of the voters have to approve these particular rates, and no county has ever imposed either of these rates. Any county whose population is less than 700,000 has the authority to impose this rate up until September 30th of 2029. Effective October 1st, 2029, though, the authority for all counties except a county whose population is between 100,000 and 700,000 goes away. So effective on that date, October 1st, 2029, only Washoe County could impose this rate. But in any event, none of the 16 counties that could impose this rate are. The next one underneath that, NRS 377C.100, came out of legislation approved during the 2013 session that gave the authority to a county whose population is between 100,000 and 700,000. In other words, Washoe County could impose a rate of up to 0.25% for school district capital projects, as long as the ordinance that was adopting or imposing the rate was adopted by their Board of County Commissioners by January 1st, 2014, and it had to be approved by a 2/3 majority vote. That did not occur. So the statutory citation NRS 377C.100 is there, but at this point, no county can impose the rate because no county can meet the criteria within that section. And then the last one is the Elko County Hospital Tax Act, and this came out of the 1997 session, that the Elko County Board of Commissioners could enact an ordinance imposing a rate of up to 1% for the construction of a county hospital with voter approval. The county commission submitted a question to the voters at a special election in 1998, and that failed. So as a result, the tax was never imposed. The authority for Elko County to impose the rate is there. They would just need voter approval to do so. And with that, I am glad to answer any questions because that is all I had for agenda item 7.
Thank you for that. And members, I know that when you see all these tables, it's a lot, but it's a really good, I won't even call it a cheat sheet. It's one of those tables for me that when I sit in other committees and people start talking about what they're spending money on, what they need money for, it's like that list runs through my mind and I'm thinking like, okay, but you have this money for this in your local jurisdiction. So what are you using that for? What is it dedicated for? And I think it also will help frame your questions in a different way when folks put out their needs. Because they should be giving you the pie of the services and they should be giving you a pie of their revenue streams and what they're going towards. And now when you see these tax calculations, you get a chance to kind of have a deeper insight on the local revenue option taxes that they are using. And I think it will help you guys in the future to say, I really want to know about that 2020 school education money that's going to Clark County in addition to the general fund. What are you doing with it? Who is it going to? How are you serving people with it? That was $56 million. And I think those are legitimate questions. But with that said, who has questions for Mr. Nakamoto? All right, Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you, Chair Neal. So my question, and I don't know if it's on here and maybe I missed it, but I was just looking at the very last slide you went over, and it talks about some of these supplemental taxes and there's the column at the end that says is voter approval required. And so my question was, do we have a rundown of, statewide would be easy, but local jurisdictions who have tried to enact local taxes and put it in front of their voters? I'm just curious to know, because I think the last few we've heard about, with the exception of the Washoe County School and perhaps the fuel revenue indexing, I think everything else has sort of been no. So I'm just curious to know that if we have that at some point, because, to Chair Neal's point, sometimes we get asked to fund things on the state level, and it's like, well, you have the ability on the local level to do it, but then the local voters don't want it and vote it down. So it leaves us, I think, in a pretty unique position, maybe an unenviable position at the state level, to decide how to deal with that. So that was kind of my question, if we had a rundown or could get a rundown at some point of just local efforts when voters were involved, and whether those efforts were fruitful or not.
Assemblyman Yeager, Michael Nakamoto for the record. That is something we have not necessarily compiled. You've given a couple of examples where we become acutely aware of them. The fuel tax indexing and some sales tax questions are the ones that immediately come to mind. But I don't know if we have a comprehensive list of ballot questions that have tax questions or tax implications that we have ever compiled. That's something perhaps we could have a conversation with either our research library or possibly the Secretary of State's office, since they are good about keeping a history of ballot questions, both at the state and local level, with respect to, okay, what were the tax questions that may have been asked in the past, and what was the success or failure of those questions.
Okay. So any additional questions? Okay, seeing none. Then we'll move to 7.
I think you mean 8, Madam Chair.
Oh yeah, agenda item number 8. Sorry, present on liquor tax. This was our follow-up. We didn't get to this table from last meeting, and I wanted to include it today.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. Agenda item 8 begins on page 91 of the PDF, is page 89 of the packet. And if you'll bear with me 1 second, I will bring that up on my screen. Okay, so on you can see on table 1 for this agenda item, the overview of liquor tax rates imposed under current law in Nevada. We tried to make it look similar to the sales and use tax rates because that was actually our starting point. We decided while we were putting information together for the last meeting relating to liquor taxes, we would use a similar format. We just have fewer columns, and this is actually a far shorter table. We start with because we get rid of the area in which the rate is imposed, because all of the liquor taxes that we're talking about under Chapter 369 are statewide rates. So you get rid of that area where it's imposed. They're all statewide. But we have a purpose. We have the current rate imposed. We have the statutory authority, which are all in Chapter 369. The date or rate was first imposed. And again, this is when the rate was first put into place. It's not necessarily that current rate. And then the FY21 actual collections. Again, this is either information that we have gotten from the Department of Taxation or that we've gotten from the Controller's Office. So the first the first block that you can see there is the total state general fund. Since the bulk of liquor tax revenue goes to the state general fund, the Department of Taxation does not report the collections by liquor type, but they impose it's aggregated, and so they report it as a total. So, so you can see for this line, it's the revenue that goes to the state general fund. The rate depends on the type of liquor, and I'll go through that as we go through here. And it's all controlled by NRS 369.330, based on rates that were first put into place on July 1st, 1945, with total collections in FY21 of just over $43.5 million. Going down this particular table, we move to malt beverages, which include beer. And as we go through this, we'll refer to this category, the malt beverage category in subsection 4 of NRS 369.330 as beer. And that is currently taxed at a rate of 16 cents per gallon. Again, with it beginning on July 1st, 1945. The next category is liquor containing more than 0.5% up to and including 14% alcohol by volume, which is taxed at a rate of 70 cents per wine gallon or proportionate part thereof. And this is under subsection 3 of 369.330. Then you have liquor containing more than 14% up to and including 22% alcohol by volume, which we will refer to as cordials as we're going forward. That is taxed at a rate of $1.30 per wine gallon or proportionate part thereof, pursuant to subsection 2 of NRS 369.330. And then finally, we have liquor containing more than 22% alcohol by volume that we also call hard liquor. And you can see 3 separate rates there. The total rate is $3.60 per wine gallon or proportionate part thereof, but it's broken out with one portion of $2.95 per wine gallon or proportionate part thereof going to the state general fund, 50 cents per wine gallon or proportionate part thereof going to the local government tax distribution account, otherwise known as the C-tax. Cities, counties, and other districts get a cut of liquor tax revenue from this category of liquor through the C-tax. And then the tax on liquor program account is a funding source for the Department of Health and Human Services. I believe it's the Division of Public and Behavioral Health, or for funding of alcohol treatment programs and the like. They get 15 cents per wine gallon or proportionate part thereof. And that part of the tax went into place in 1981 with the local portion, but even before it went to the C-tax going into effect in 1969. So on the next page are notes that kind of go through the overview and the history of the liquor tax, and you can see that on the following page as well. On page 92 of the packet, you have table 2, which is an overview of the liquor tax rates by component and liquor type. And it's basically taking that information and putting it together so you can see the total rate by liquor type. So you have malt beverages, beer at 16 cents, the 0.5 up to 14% alcohol by volume, the wine component at 70 cents, the over 14 up to 22%, the cordials at $1.30, and then the over 22%, the hard liquor at $3.60, because you have the $2.95 portion, the 50 cents, and then the 15 cents to add up to that $3.60. On the next page is we've graphed it in the same way, so you can see that this one's a little more straightforward than the sales tax one, where you had all the different components that could put in or to be put in. And again, you can see that the only one that is affected by multiple components is the hard liquor category on the far right. Table 3 is taking all of the tax rate changes that have happened on this per gallon structure for liquor since this tax was put into place. And it's information that's contained in the notes for table 1, but we decided to pull that out and kind of show what the evolution of this particular tax has been, if you will. The legislature during the 1945 session created the current system for how we tax liquor in Nevada in Assembly Bill 178. And so you can see there that all of the proceeds went to the state general fund. The malt beverages or beer were originally taxed at a rate of 3 cents per gallon. The wine category, that up to 14%, was taxed at a rate of 15 cents per gallon. But one of the things that you've noticed under the tax basis for this particular liquor type is that originally when this tax was put into place, the tax was only, this 15 cent per gallon tax was only on liquor between 8 and 14% alcohol by volume. So for the next category, 14% to 22%, the cordials, it was originally taxed at a rate of 25 cents. And then the over 22%, the hard liquor, was at a rate of 60 cents. In the next session, the legislature came back in Assembly Bill 151 and made that change to the wine category. That one was originally at 8% to 14% alcohol by volume, changed that to 0.5% to 14% at what it is today, and maintained that rate of 15 cents. The first change to the rates occurred in 1961 in Senate Bill 201. And so effective May 1st of 1961, the rates increased. And in all cases, or in 3 of the 4 cases, they doubled. Malt beverages, beer went from 3 cents to 6 cents. Wine went from 15 cents to 30 cents. Cordials went from 25 cents to 50 cents. The only one that more than doubled was the hard liquor category that went from 60 cents to $1.40. The next row you can see there is SB 439 of the 1969 session, which created that 50-cent tax rate for local governments that you still see today. That rate has never changed. The distribution has changed. SB 439 originally said that if the distribution of this particular portion of the tax to a county and the cities within the county depended on how many incorporated cities were within the county. So if you have a county that has no incorporated cities, which includes Carson City, the county or Carson City in that instance got all of the proceeds. If there is a county with 1 incorporated city, then the proceeds from that tax were divided between the city and the county based on their share of the population. But if it is a county with 2 or more cities, then the cities would share the revenue from this rate, and the county would get none of the revenue. And this is how the distribution of this tax worked until the C-tax was put into place during the 1997 session. The next change you can see there was Assembly Bill 247 from the 1981 session, which increased the hard liquor from the $1.90 to $2.05 to add that 15 cents that went into what was known as the alcohol and drug abuse account. That is the account that is now known as the Tax on Liquor Program account that is now administered by DPBH. The next rate change to the rates for all of the categories except for hard liquor occurred during the 1983 session, where malt beverages were increased from 6 cents to 9 cents. Wine was increased from 30 cents to 40 cents. The cordials category was increased from 50 cents to 75 cents. And those are the rates that remained until the 2003 special session. It was Senate Bill 8 of the 20th special session that said that effective August 1st of 2003, the current rates, what we have in statute today, are the rates that are imposed. And so I think one of the things that I would point out with this particular table is that you've seen these shifts in the tax rates now 4 times. The first one took 16 years from 1945 to 1961. The next one took 22 years from 1961 to 1983. And then the third one took 20 years from 1983 to 2003 to get the rates that we have today. And then the last table, table 4, is an example of there's a single liquor tax rate that is codified under current law, but that's not being currently authorized or imposed. And this is in NRS 369.333 that said that any liquor containing more than 22% of alcohol by volume that's imported into the state after July 1st, 1965 has an additional tax of $1.50 per wine gallon that will be put on it, but only if the federal gallonage tax that is imposed pursuant to Section 5001 of Title 26 of the United States Code reduced, if that tax rate were reduced to $9 per wine gallon. Not going to get too much into the story behind that. It's largely in the notes there. I can answer questions about it. Suffice it to say, though, the federal government did not reduce that rate to $9. In fact, since then, they have only increased the rate. Therefore, the statutory authority for this rate exists, but the rate has never been imposed. And barring some sort of drastic reduction to the federal rate, it will not be imposed. Moving forward to page 97 is some information similar to the information that Mr. Ginden put together on cannabis tax collections. We've done something similar for liquor tax collections but this time, because this tax has been imposed for far longer, we've just put information together by fiscal year. So you can see the total liquor tax collections, and this is all of the rates. So it's the C-tax portion, the tax on liquor program account portion, and the state general fund portions rolled together. And so you can see the change in the rate, as well as information on the effective tax rate per gallon. You can see we've highlighted FY 2004 here, because you can see that the collections and the effective rate per gallon drastically jumped. And again, that was as a result of the tax changes that were approved during the special session, the 20th special session in July of 2003. The next column that you can see there is the portion that went to the state general fund. And so it's basically that total less the C-tax portion and the tax on liquor program account portion with the share of the total collections. So you can see in FY 2021, the general fund portion is just over 90% of the total. And then again, the effective tax rate per gallon that is going to the state general fund. And then this, the last columns on this particular table show the total gallons by all liquor types. And so you can see the tax collections that generated the approximately $48.3 million total, or $43.5 million for the general fund, were based on the import of approximately 91.1 million gallons of liquor of all types into the state. On table 2, we break those total gallons from those last columns out by type. So you can see the types there: beer, wine, cordials, and hard liquor, and how those have changed over time. One of the things that you will notice is that beer is the predominant liquor that is imported. It makes up more than 3/4 of the tax, or of the liquor gallons that are accounted for by the Department of Taxation. But you can also see that that number is declining. It was in the 84% or thereabout range in the mid to late 90s, but has now dropped to right around 78.5%, closer to 79%, depending on the year. The next category, wine, you can see that is one of the smaller categories, or it's actually the second largest category, but compared to beer, it is a considerably smaller category. But this is one that is actually historically increasing. Whether the decreases in the last couple of years have anything to do with the pandemic or anything else, we're not certain. But it makes up just over 10% of the total gallons. Cordials is the smallest by far, making up only about 2%. And this is actually increasing from a point where during much of the 90s, it was less than 1%. And then hard liquor kind of stays in that constant, although it did decrease for a while during the 2000s. But it started off, or it's at a point that is a little higher than it was in FY90, just over 8%. One of the things that the Department of Taxation does not do is they, like I mentioned on table 1, they from the rates themselves is they don't break out collections by liquor type. So table 3 is basically taking the gallons and applying the tax rates that are applicable to each category and imputing a total amount of taxes that are due and having a total that is there. This is not going to match the actual total for a few reasons. The actual totals that are reported by the Department of Taxation or that are dedicated to the various purposes will include penalties and interest and things that we don't account for, prior period collections and so on. There's also a taxpayer collection allowance that the taxpayer is allowed to keep as long as they pay their taxes on time. For the longest time, this taxpayer collection allowance was at a rate of 3%, but during 2003 special sessions, it was reduced to the current rate of 0.5%. We don't account for that in here because partially because of that change, but just to keep everything apples to apples, we're showing what the imputed taxes would be. And basically what you can see out of this is even though beer makes up about 80% of the gallons, if not more, they only make up in the neighborhood of 24% of the collections. Hard liquor, even though it's only 8% of the gallons, makes up more than half of the collections based on this imputed calculation. And that's a function of the rates being so different, the 16 cents for beer versus $3.60 for hard liquor. Moving forward, from here are some charts that are similar to what Mr. Ginden put together in terms of some of the information that's put in those particular tables. So the first is gallons by type. So you can see the blue line there is beer. It is the vast majority, again, of the liquor that is imported into the state. And then you have wine. Hard liquor is the yellow line, and then cordials is that line at the bottom that's just barely seems to be moving. The next one is the share of total gallons. So it's each category as a portion of the total, and you can see again, beer maintains the predominance, followed by wine, then hard liquor, then cordials. The next one is taking the actual gallons and indexing them to FY90. So with FY90 at 1, you can see basically, okay, how many more gallons for each type do you have, or what is the magnitude compared to FY90? So beer is only at around 1.6. So there's about 60% more beer gallons that are being imported now than were being imported in FY90. Hard liquor is around 1.8. Wine is at about 2, just over 2. But then cordials you can see at 3.8. But again, because there are so few cordial gallons, as we showed in the previous tables, that's just a function of, okay, you had a small amount and you're growing it. And sometimes when you grow a small amount, it can distort the growth factors by that. And so then we've done the same thing on this next chart with the imputed taxes due. This is again taking the gallons times the tax rate. And again, one of the things that you'll notice there is the jump from FY 2003 to FY 2004 because of the growth or the increase in the rates that was approved during the 20th special session. And then the next chart is the share of imputed total taxes due by the type of liquor tax category. And these again are going to mirror the actual collections in some sense, since you have the predominant amount of the collections coming from hard liquor, followed by beer, then wine, and then cordials down at the bottom that gets to close to 5%. And then the imputed total taxes due that is indexed to FY90 with the, again, the big jump in the imputed taxes due to the tax increases from 2003 going into FY 2004. And then finally, you have on chart 7, the share of total actual gallons and the share of total imputed tax gallons. So it's taking some of the information from the previous charts and putting them together so you can see how all of these interact and move with each other. And that is the end of this particular agenda item and all of the information that I had for it. I would be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nakamoto, for going over this. Does anybody have any questions on this? Assemblywoman Anderson?
I have so many, but I'll make, I might be setting up some meetings offline as well. Just very quickly though, with the different levels of alcohol, of the different taxations, has there ever been any discussion about having them all in the same classification, or is this something that is utilized across the nation to have the different levels? And also it's done at the gallon level as opposed to a different measurement. Again, is that standard for the taxation across our nation when it comes to the alcohol, or is this something that is, as many things are, unique to our lovely state of Nevada?
Michael Nakamoto for the record. My understanding, Assemblywoman Anderson, is a lot of the taxation of liquor is an artifact of coming out of prohibition. And since this is something that has been in place since the 1945 session, I am led to believe that that's kind of how at least Nevada got to that point. I can't speak to how other states are taxing alcohol specifically. This is something I don't know if Director Hughes might be able to answer that question as kind of a comparison. But if she can't, that is some information that we can try and get our hands on for you.
Thank you for that. So, Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you, Chair Neal. Just a quick question. So I noticed in fiscal year 2020, we see a bit of a decrease in gallons. I guess it would be gallons taxed or imported into the state. Not a huge decrease, but I just wondered if there was a belief that that was a result of the pandemic and closures where people weren't going out and consuming during that time period, or do we think something else was going on then?
Assemblyman Yeager, Michael Nakamoto for the record, as your fiscal staff and as economists who look at this sort of thing, that's the direction that we would go, that you have the major purchasers of alcohol in this state being your large casinos, your restaurants, other hospitality venues and establishments that would be purchasing and then reselling a significant amount of liquor, not being able to do so either because of closures or because of travel restrictions or the like, that had fewer bodies flat out coming to Nevada for tourism or for whatever purpose. So they just, we believe that because there was less demand from those establishments, that there needed to be less liquor that was imported into the state.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you for presenting, Mr. Nakamoto. So for everybody's edification, we're gonna skip agenda item number 9. We're gonna go to agenda item number 10. And then after agenda item number 10, we're gonna close out, go to public comment and then adjourn. And so we will go to Mr. Reel because this was another piece that we did get to. I mean, but I have to say this, all right? But you guys know that I'm a revenue junkie. So it's good information. So go ahead, Mr. Reel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Joe Reel, Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And I'll go ahead and share agenda item number 10. And this begins on page 197 of your packet and page 127 of your packet, 129 of the PDF file. So this is the set of tables that we use at the fiscal year 22 forecast compared to the actual collections. So starting with table 1, this is a summary which shows the FY21 actual collections for each revenue source that we display here. And then the FY22 forecast here in the center in the tan color. And then on the far right, we have the percentage of the total general fund that each revenue source comprises of the total. So just to walk through the information on this first table, I'll start with the sales and use tax. So you have the FY21 actual collections of $1.325 billion approximately. And that represented a 9.1% growth over the FY2020 actual collections. So what we show next to that is the growth rate that was forecast by the Economic Forum when they prepared their forecast for FY21. So we're doing this so that you can visually see that the actual revenue came in significantly higher than what the Economic Forum forecast for the sales tax that we're looking at. So then when we go to the FY22 forecast that we're looking at, you see the $1,301,969,000. And that represents from the Economic Forum's original forecast was anticipated to be a 4.8% growth. However, that was based on their forecast of 2.3%. So when we look at the FY22 forecast for each revenue source and here in the sales tax, the forecast is now a 1.8% decline relative to the forecast compared to the actual collections from FY21. So as we look at these, you'll see that the forecast is based on the actual collections, and you'll see these growth rates. And in this case, the sales tax minus 1.8. And again, we're showing that because the form did not actually forecast minus 1.8% growth. They forecasted the 1,301,969,000. So as we look at these, we show this just to illustrate that the growth rates are a product of the actuals coming in higher or lower than the original forecast for the previous year. So that's what this table is showing us, just for reference, the 21 actuals, 22 forecasts, and those statistics. And again, you have the percentage of the general fund. So in terms of what we're showing, I just want to spend a little time on this table to show that we have the major general fund revenues, which is shown here: sales and use tax, gaming percentage fees, insurance premium, and so forth. And so this major block of revenues makes up just approximately 80% of the total general fund. And then we have the select non-major or kind of minor general fund revenues here in this block, which makes up just over 10% of the total revenues. And then we have, of course, the all other general fund category, which is the remainder of the revenues that are not shown specifically here. And then we have the tax credits that come off after the gross revenue. So these are all shown as the total gross revenues. And then we have the tax credits that come off of the individual revenues. Since we don't know when the tax credits are going to hit and what revenue sources necessarily going to go against, we're not able to allocate them to the specific revenues initially. And so we're just documenting what those amounts are here. So moving to table 2 within this set, page 128 of the packet. And I'll have to move my little window here. So this is the actual FY22 collections let me just start with the beginning here. That you have a reference for the FY21 year-to-date actual collections, the FY22 year-to-date actual collections, and then the FY22 forecast year-to-date. And so for each revenue source, we have the numbers in parentheses, 6 months, 8 months. And so this is reflecting the that we've got 6 months to 8 months of revenue for the monthly revenues, and the first 2 quarters of revenues for the quarterly revenue sources. So again, just to walk through the sales and use tax to understand everything that we're showing in the table, we have the year-to-date through those first 6 months for the sales and use tax, and that represented a 6.9% decline compared to FY 2020. And then we're showing the percentage that this year-to-date actual represents of the full year. So in FY21, this represented 46.8% of the total revenue collected for the entire fiscal year. And then we're showing similar information here in FY22. Year-to-date actuals for sales tax are up 28.6% through this first 6 months, and that represents 61.3% of the total revenue that we forecast for the year. When we look at the forecast amount of 608 million, 609 million rounding, the forecast was for minus 1.8%. So given that we're up 28.6%, the collections year to date through this first 6 months for sales tax is up 188,709,000. So as we look at each of these revenues, I won't go through all of them in particular, but you can just see that generally all of the revenues in this major category, with the exception of commerce tax, are running above the forecast through this first 6 to 8 months in the first 2 quarters. So for that major general fund revenues, this block that accounts for approximately 80%, you can see that we're approximately $598.5 million above the forecast, or 35.3% above the forecast amount year to date. And then looking at the non-major revenue categories, again, each of the individual non-major revenues that we have listed here, you can see those are up 51.5 million over the forecast through this 6 to 8 months. And that's 17.4% above the forecast. All of the other general fund revenues are up to 18.5 million, or 19.5% above. So in total, through this first 6 to 8 months in the first 2 quarters, total general fund revenue is approximately $668.6 million above the forecast, or 32.6% higher than the year-to-date forecast that was anticipated. And so that's really the information that we wanted to highlight for this particular meeting, and just to show the year-to-date collections thus far. And really the rest of the tables I'll briefly go through and just explain what they are. But this is really the information that we wanted to
okay.
Committee.
So I just want to quickly say, don't start thinking about how you're going to spend that extra, because you also have to consider what were the maintenance for buildings, what were the things that we didn't fully fund in terms of services that we may still have to think about. So when you're thinking, we're cash flush, the question is, if we look at the budget as a whole, have we covered all the maintenance? Like, for example, Department of Tax, they sit in a building that they probably shouldn't be in. I just want to put that out there. And then you can go on, Mr. Real, and then we can close out.
So just to go through the rest of the tables, as I mentioned, this is showing before tax credits the gross amount of revenue that was forecast and collected thus far on gross terms. Then table 3 is just sort of showing what's remaining to be collected throughout each of the current fiscal year and then for the prior fiscal year. So this is just a way of documenting what's left to be collected. So just for reference, through FY22, we have just less than 40% of the revenues that need to be collected for this fiscal year to hit that forecast, whereas last fiscal year, we needed more than 53% of the revenues to be collected in the second sort of half of the fiscal year to make the forecast. Tables 4 and 5 are essentially kind of the same reference as tables 1 and 2 in terms of this. Table 4 is showing the FY21 actual and FY22 forecast, but it's showing the net amounts that you would actually see in the state controller system for the revenues that would actually be collected after any allocation of tax credits. So this is just the reference of what the tax credit can be taken against the percentage fees, the insurance premium tax, or the modified business tax. So this just shows the actual and forecast amounts if we take into account the credits that we know will be taken against those revenue sources. And then we still have those other credits that we don't know where they're going to land down below to be subtracted afterwards. So that's just the full fiscal year forecast after tax credits. Table 5 is the same year-to-date information that we were looking at, but the dollar amounts you'll see different from what's in Table 2 is that the tax credits that have been taken against these revenues are reflected here. And then you'll see the same dollar difference in terms of how the actual is going against the forecast. And table 6 is just sort of a ledger where you can see the intimate details for fiscal year 21 and 22 forecast, and then the year-to-date numbers for each of the revenue sources that are impacted by the tax credits, which are the modified business tax on this first section, the gaming percentage fee tax, and the insurance premium tax on the second part of table 6, and then the summary of just what the tax credits forecast and actuals are coming in so far. And you can see that we've accounted for thus far approximately 50% of all the tax credits that are scheduled to be taken against FY22. So that's the remainder of the tables that are in the packet, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Real, I have a quick question before we kind of wrap up. Do we ever, like, when we go through legislative session and legislators have their bills that are being funded, and some of them are one-offs, but the whole goal of that one-off is an individual member is probably seeking to come back the next session to ultimately get that bill paid for because now it's policy in action. Do we ever calculate what those potential one-offs will cost in the future to determine like that revenue impact? And it's kind of like the same way how we do tax credits, like after the tax credits are off the books, like we kind of set aside this money with the potential idea that this is probably going to be how much it costs. But do we do that with one-offs? So we know, okay, well, there were $700,000 or $1 million in bills that legislators passed as a one-off revenue for 2021, but we know we're going to need to continue to pay $1 million in 2023 in order to keep that legislation running. Does that make sense?
Madam Chair, this is Russell in fiscal, and if it's okay, I'll just try and address that one. I think I understand your concept and use of the term one-off, and I just want to be careful that in our parlance, we sort of use, well, it's clearly a one-shot, meaning in a sense, the legislature making a decision to appropriate money for that thing. Now, could it come back and be more than a one and done in the next session? But generally, well, we're appropriating the money and then we're saying you use that money, and then if you don't use it all, it reverts back. Versus, I think what you might be referring to, well, we could have a program which we're appropriating money, say, for only this biennium, and there's some suspicion that it might be an ongoing thing and then you're going to be back the next session and having to address it. Can that happen? Yes. Does the Fiscal Analysis Division, are we looking at that and trying to take that into consideration and then working with members of the money committees on that? But again, the bottom line is that we're in a budget process, right, where the governor comes in and recommends a budget to the legislature for the next biennium, and then the legislature is approving a budget for the next biennium. And so that's really the budget cycle, but I don't want to imply or indicate that those types of things that you're referring to aren't taken into consideration when we're looking at proposals in terms of what they could mean. But also within a program, right, you have to go, well, clearly there can be startup costs. So those one-time costs within a program, there can be one-time costs that are right to get the program up and running. And then the filter out of what are the ongoing costs? For instance, say you need $5 million, but when you're looking at it, well, 4 million of that is one to get the program up and running, and then 1 million is potentially the sustainable ongoing. But then because of inflation or caseload growth, that could grow in future biennium. So that's the best to try and address that staff and fiscal and even the governor's budget office. We're looking at those kinds of things during the budget process during session. So.
Okay. Thank you for that. So are there any questions as we close? Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you, Chair. This will hopefully be a quick one. Obviously encouraged by the first 6 months, but I heed the caution of Chair Neal that we ought not be spending that money yet. But my question is, historically as a state, if we could back out the pandemic years, because I know those were historically difficult, but do we tend to collect revenues evenly throughout the calendar year? And really the question is, we have the first 6 months of the fiscal year. Do we expect, absent some crazy circumstance, that the next 6 months will be fairly similar, or is there usually a drop or increase in the second half of the fiscal year for some reason?
Senator Yeager, again, Joe Reel for the record. In general, it's kind of 50-50. We're just past half of the fiscal year, and looking at the information on table 2, we've collected 60.9% of our total revenue for the year, so we've got just 40% to go. Looking at FY21, when it was affected by the pandemic, we only had 45.9% of the revenue and had more than that to collect. So some revenues do come in at the end of the year, and that does affect things. So I guess it's going to vary from time to time and year to year. But generally, I wouldn't expect a huge drop off necessarily in the second half of the year.
Madam Chair, if I may, just Russell Ginden, Fiscal Analysis Division, just to add to my colleague Joe Reel's comments that for Assemblyman Yeager's, that I think what you're asking is, okay, if we're a little over halfway through and we're almost $669 million above the forecast, are we sitting here thinking we're going to be $1.2, $1.3 billion above the forecast by the end of the fiscal year? I don't think so, because one of the things is it gets very hard to do the methodology that we do in general, but especially during business cycle turning points, to take a fiscal year forecast and translate it into months or quarters. But also the last part of FY21, that's when things were starting to get better. The stimulus money was getting out there. In fact, remember March 21 was our first billion record gaming win. So we think the comparisons are going to they're still going to be probably good, but they're not going to be as good over the end of FY 2022 here as they were over the beginning of FY 2022. So we think this 668 million, that delta could continue to grow, but you won't see the orders of magnitude that we've seen in the first half, probably over the second half, if that helps answer your question at all.
Okay. So, Assemblyman Yeager, that does answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful.
All right. Any additional questions? Okay. So we will, agenda item number 11, basically, you guys have pretty much all answered the poll. So I know Ms. Freeman will put out, I think we have the next 2 dates. It's going to be pretty similar to kind of the end of the month. So that should come out probably this week or next week, giving you guys the dates for April and May. And then we will go ahead and move to agenda item number 12, which is public comment. BPS, is there anyone on the line?
Thank you, Chair. The line is open and working, but currently we have no callers wishing to give public comment at this time.
Okay, so thank you for that. So we will go ahead and adjourn. And everybody, hopefully you'll have a really good Wednesday